Nobody touch it! Logan Steele's voice cut through 600 people like a blade. The Iron Beast had just gone silent in front of the largest charity ride in Riverside's history, and every expert in the parking lot took a step back. I'm not kidding. The first person who can bring her back gets $5.4 million. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. That moment, that was the beginning of something nobody saw coming. If you're watching this right now, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change the way you think about talent pride and what it really means to understand something. The charity ride had been Logan Steele's idea from the beginning, and nobody in the Southwest motorcycle community had been surprised by that. Logan did everything at scale. When other chapters organized small weekend runs for veterans funds, Logan coordinated multi-state events that drew network coverage. When other builders unveiled custom bikes at private shops, Logan rented out the Riverside Convention Center parking complex and invited every journalist, fabricator, and riding club within 400 miles. He wasn't a showman in the cheap sense of the word. He was something more dangerous than that. He was a man who genuinely believed that the right display of excellence could move people, could shake money loose from corporate sponsors, could pull young riders into responsible chapters, could remind a grieving community of veterans that people still cared enough to show up in numbers. The Iron Beast had been his centerpiece for 11 years. She wasn't just a motorcycle. Every serious person in the room knew that before they even got close enough to see her clearly. She was the accumulation of Logan Steele's entire mechanical philosophy, a 640-pound argument that American engineering, when pursued without compromise and without shortcuts, could produce something that transcended function and became something closer to a living system. Logan had built her over 7 years, working nights in his garage in Fontana, sourcing parts from 3 different countries, rejecting components that didn't meet his personal tolerances, even when they met manufacturer spec. The frame was hand-welded chromoly that he'd learned to work himself after spending a winter apprenticed to an aerospace fabricator in Tucson. The engine was a custom displacement V-twin that his friend Ray Caruso had helped import and polish over 18 months of weekends. The fuel management system had been calibrated and recalibrated more than 40 times until the throttle response matched exactly what Logan felt in his chest when he imagined the perfect machine. She had never failed, not once. Not at a single charity ride, not on a single cross-country run, not during the 3 separate times Logan had lent her to established mechanics for evaluation and study. She had 112,000 miles on her odometer, and every one of those miles was documented in a logbook that Logan kept in a fireproof safe at his house. That morning, he'd started her up at 6:45 in his hotel parking lot, the same way he always did, choke and throttle at a quarter turn, 2 pumps of the primer key over. She caught on the first try. She always did. By 9:30, the Riverside complex was already packed. The Hells Angels contingent had ridden in from 3 separate chapters, San Bernardino, Fontana, and one group Logan recognized from previous rides out of Victorville. They weren't there for the spectacle, not exactly. Most of them had known Logan Steele for over a decade. Big Ray Cortez, who ran the San Bernardino chapter's internal mechanics, had actually helped Logan source the transmission housing 2 years into the build. There was history between these men, and it showed in the way they greeted each other, not with performance, but with the quiet nod of people who've shared real work. The crowd by the central display area had reached somewhere between 600 and 800 people by 10:15. Event organizers were counting wristbands near the entrance gates and muttering to each other about capacity. Camera crews from 2 local stations had set up on the elevated platform to the east, and a third crew Logan didn't recognize had arrived with equipment that looked more suited to a documentary production than a morning news segment. Logan wasn't nervous. He was never nervous about the Iron Beast. He was standing beside her when Danny Reeves found him threading through the crowd with 2 coffees and the slightly harried expression of a man who'd been answering logistical questions since 7 in the morning. Danny was Logan's closest friend in the riding community, not because they were similar men, but because they balanced each other in ways that mattered. Logan was instinct and vision. Danny was process and patience. Together, they had organized 11 of these events without a single serious incident. "How's she running?" Danny handed over the coffee without looking at the bike. "Perfect," Logan said, and he meant it with the full weight of everything that word carried between them. Danny nodded. Got a call this morning from Harrington, the fabricator from Phoenix. He's here. Brought 2 of his guys. That's fine. He wants to get up close for photos, maybe video. Logan considered that. After the display run, tell him after. At 10:45, the program opened. The MC, a big warm man named Gerald, who had been hosting these rides for 8 years, worked the crowd through the introductions, the charity overview, the acknowledgement of sponsors. Logan only half listened. He was watching the Iron Beast the way a father watches a child at a recital, not because he doubted her, but because witnessing her in front of people who didn't yet understand what they were looking at was always its own private satisfaction. When Gerald called his name, Logan walked to the center display zone with the easy, unhurried movement of a man who had done this many times and never needed to perform it. The crowd gave him room. Not out of fear, exactly, though Logan Steele at 61 was still the kind of man who occupied physical space in a way that made people unconsciously adjust, but out of the particular deference that an entire community extends to someone whose credibility has been earned across decades rather than claimed in a moment. He introduced the Iron Beast in his own words without notes. He didn't use the word masterpiece, though plenty of others had. He talked about the principles that had guided her construction, the refusal to prioritize aesthetics over function, the commitment to understanding each system before connecting it to the next, the belief that a machine built with genuine attention would respond to that attention with genuine reliability. She's done 112,000 miles, he said, and she's never let me down. The crowd responded. There was applause. There was the particular vocal appreciation of people who understood what that number meant for a custom build, and there was the visible excitement of the camera crews repositioning for a better angle. Logan reached down and turned the key. The Iron Beast caught a single cylinder firing and then stopped. The crowd didn't react at first. A single failed start on a cold morning wasn't unusual, and the morning had been cool. Logan didn't react either. He waited the appropriate interval, then reached for the key again. Nothing. Not a single cylinder. Not a sputter. There was a laugh somewhere in the crowd. Light, not cruel, just the reflexive response to the mildly absurd situation of a legendary machine choosing its most public moment to be uncooperative. Logan heard it. His jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his face neutral. He tried again. The starter motor turned, but the engine did not respond. More laughter now. Louder, spreading the way crowd laughter always spreads when it senses permission. Someone called out from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, "Need a jump," and got enough response to feel rewarded for it. Logan stood up slowly. He put his hands on the tank. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned to face the crowd with an expression that stopped the laughter faster than a raised hand would have. "All right," he said. The microphone Gerald was holding caught his voice clearly. "Here's what's going to happen." The crowd settled. Something in his tone had shifted the atmosphere without announcing the shift. "I've got 20 mechanics here today, professionals, men who've been working on bikes for 30 years. I'm going to give every single one of them a shot at this." He paused. "And I'm adding $5.4 million to the charity fund for whoever brings her back." The silence that followed that statement was the kind that has physical weight. It pressed against the crowd from all sides, and for 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the crowd erupted. Not with the clean enthusiasm of an organized response, but with the chaotic, overlapping sound of hundreds of people processing something unexpected at the same time. Shock, disbelief, the sudden calculation of whether he meant it, the turning to the person next to you to verify that you heard what you thought you heard. Danny Reeves, standing 8 feet away, went completely still. He set his coffee down on a nearby surface with the deliberate automatic care of a man whose hands needed to be empty while his brain caught up with what his ears had just reported. Logan didn't elaborate. He stepped back from the microphone, folded his arms, and waited. The first mechanic was on his knees beside the Iron Beast within 4 minutes. His name was Tom Harrington, the fabricator from Phoenix that Danny had mentioned. Harrington was 53 years old, had built custom bikes for 22 years, and had once been profiled in Cycle World for a twin-engine build that had earned legitimate attention from the engineering community. He came prepared because Harrington always came prepared. He had a full diagnostic kit in his truck, and he sent one of his 2 assistants running for it the moment Logan finished speaking. Harrington worked methodically and without comment for the first 20 minutes. He connected his ECU reader and got the readout that would confuse every subsequent mechanic who looked at it, all systems nominal. No fault codes, no error flags. The bike's onboard diagnostics reported a machine in perfect operational condition. He double-checked the fuel delivery, checked the spark, went through the ignition sequence, manually tracing current from the battery through the relay system with a voltmeter reading every junction in sequence. Everything was right. Everything showed right. He tried a restart. Nothing. Harrington sat back on his heels and said quietly to his nearest assistant, "That's not possible." His assistant, a young man named Carlos who had worked for Harrington for 4 years and had learned not to argue with readouts, looked at the diagnostic screen and then at the bike and said nothing. Harrington tried 3 more approaches over the following 25 minutes. He wasn't rushing. He was being genuinely careful because a machine that diagnostic software called Healthy but refused to run was not a machine with an obvious problem. It was a machine with a hidden problem, and hidden problems required patience and methodical elimination. He eliminated fuel delivery. He eliminated spark sequencing. He checked the ECU connections, physically reseating connectors that showed no fault but might have a micro-intermittent contact issue. Nothing. At the 50-minute mark, Harrington stood up, removed his gloves, and told Logan Steele directly, "I can't find it. Not with what I've got here. I'd need to take her into a controlled environment." Logan nodded once, appreciated Tom. Harrington walked away, and something shifted in the crowd as he did. Tom Harrington walking away from a problem wasn't something people had seen before. The second mechanic was a Harley-Davidson master technician named Paul Becker, who had driven up from San Diego specifically because a friend had texted him at 7 in the morning that something interesting was happening in Riverside. Becker had 30 years of certified Harley work behind him and had trained 16 junior technicians who were currently working in shops across 3 states. He did not make the same diagnostic moves as Harrington. Where Harrington had started with the ECU, Becker went physical first hands on every component, feeling for heat signatures, checking for anything that moved when it shouldn't or refused to move when it should. He talked while he worked, which was apparently just how Becker operated a running low commentary that his own shop guys would have recognized as his thinking out loud process. Fuel housing looks clean, belt tension's good, these terminals are tight, somebody's been maintaining this thing seriously. He paused. Actually, somebody's been maintaining this thing better than seriously. This is almost clinical. Someone in the crowd near the front asked, "Can you fix it?" Becker didn't look up. Working on it. He worked for 40 minutes. He found to his visible frustration exactly what Harrington had found: a bike that should run and wouldn't. His diagnostic approach was different enough from Harrington's that he couldn't simply be accused of repeating the same mistakes. He was genuinely trying different entry points, different diagnostic sequences, different mechanical interventions. None of them worked. When he stood up, his expression was the particular face of a highly competent professional confronting a situation that his competence hasn't resolved, which is a face that contains both frustration and something approaching unwilling fascination. "Whatever's wrong with this bike," he said loud enough for the nearest section of the crowd to hear, "it's not wrong in any of the ways I know how to look." That statement moved through the crowd in fragments, getting reported and slightly altered as it spread outward, and by the time it reached the edges of the gathering, it had become, "The San Diego Master Tech says it can't be fixed," which wasn't what Becker had said, but was close enough to what the crowd wanted to believe that it found traction. Big Ray Cortez had been watching from 20 feet back, standing with 3 other Hells Angels members, his arms crossed and his face giving nothing away. Ray was not a performative man. He had been turning wrenches since he was 14 years old, had rebuilt engines in conditions that would have made most professional mechanics walk away, and had a reputation within the riding community for the kind of calm, systematic troubleshooting that came from having faced mechanical failure in genuinely dangerous situations and having learned to separate emotion from process. He walked up to Logan after Becker stepped away. "You serious about the money?" he said, not challenging, just establishing. Logan looked at him. "Have I ever said something I didn't mean?" Ray considered that for a moment, which was itself an answer, because anyone who'd known Logan Steele for more than 6 months knew the answer was no. "All right," he said, "let me look." What Ray did over the next 90 minutes was different from what either Harrington or Becker had done, and the difference was visible to the people who knew enough to understand what they were watching. Ray didn't start with a diagnostic system, and he didn't start with a physical inspection. He started by sitting next to the Iron Beast for a full 7 minutes without touching her, looking at the overall configuration, the routing of lines and wiring, the spatial relationship between components, the logic of how Logan had chosen to assemble the various systems. He was reading the machine the way some people read a room, looking for what was in conversation with looking for the relationships rather than the individual pieces. Then he started asking Logan questions. What changed in the last 6 months? Any modifications? New fuel housing, Logan said. Same spec as the original, just replacement. Who did the install? I did. Ray nodded slowly. Any ECU updates, firmware? Logan's expression shifted slightly. Shop ran a firmware update in February. Routine. Ray turned back to the bike. He didn't say what he was thinking yet, but something in his posture had changed, a slight intensification, the particular focus of a man who has just received information that may be relevant, but whose relevance he can't yet confirm. He spent the next hour working through a series of specific tests, not the broad diagnostic sweeps that the earlier mechanics had run, but targeted checks of specific relationships between systems. He was testing a theory, and the crowd, which had been getting restless through the second mechanic's session, picked up on the changed energy and quieted. At one point, Danny Reeves leaned down near Ray's shoulder and said quietly, "You see something?" "Maybe," Ray said. Maybe not. He kept working. At the end of the 90 minutes, Ray stood up and Logan could read his face. There was the frustration, same as the others. But there was also something else, a reluctant respect, almost for whatever was hiding in the Iron Beast's systems. "It's in the connections," Ray said to Logan, keeping his voice low. "Not in any single system, but I can't find the specific breakpoint. I know it's in how these systems are talking to each other, but I can't isolate which conversation is the problem." "What does that mean?" Logan asked. "It means," Ray said carefully, "that whoever built this thing built it so well that when something goes wrong, the machine protects its own failure. The diagnostics tell you everything's fine, because from the perspective of each individual system, everything is fine." He paused. "The failure is in the integration, and integration failures don't show up on standard diagnostics." Logan was very still. "So what do I do?" "Keep letting people try," Ray said, "because whoever finds it is going to need to understand something that most mechanics never have to think about." The next 11 mechanics came and went over the following 3 hours. A custom builder from Las Vegas who had built 11 bikes for professional riders. A retired aerospace engineer who had transitioned into motorcycle fabrication and brought tools that looked like they belonged in a laboratory. A fuel systems specialist who had been actually flown in by a sponsor who wanted the credit if he succeeded, from Portland. A man who had spent 20 years as a master technician for a major manufacturer and had consulted on 3 recall investigations. None of them found it. The social media situation had become something separate from the event itself. Someone had started live streaming at the very beginning, before Logan made his offer, and by noon the stream had accumulated viewers who had no connection to the riding community, people who had been pulled in by algorithm or by a reshared clip, who were watching not because they understood the mechanical stakes, but because the human drama had become legible to anyone. A legendary machine, a famous man, a massive reward, and a string of experts walking away empty-handed. The comment sections were brutal, in the way comment sections always are when they sense a gap between someone's reputation and their current situation. Logan Steele's name was being processed by people who had never heard it before, and first impressions formed under those circumstances are rarely generous. Words like fraud and stunt and probably rigged cycled through. Closer to the machine and the actual crowd that had been present from the beginning, the mood was different and more complicated. These were people who knew enough to understand what they were watching, and what they were watching disturbed them in a way that the internet commenters couldn't access. The Iron Beast's failure wasn't a punchline to these people. It was a genuine mystery, and genuine mysteries in a domain you respect carry a different weight than entertainment. Big Ray had drifted back to his group, but hadn't left the viewing range. He was watching each new mechanic with an expression that was part assessment and part something that might have been hope, the particular hope of someone who wants to see the problem solved, regardless of who solves it. Logan, for his part, had not left the bike's side. He stood close, but not crowding, present, watching a man who had said something in public that he fully intended to back, and was now absorbing the implications of a world in which keeping that promise was proving harder than even he had imagined. At 2:45 in the afternoon, the 23rd expert, a drivetrain specialist from Albuquerque named Marcus Webb, who had a master's degree in mechanical engineering and 28 years of applied experience, stood up from a 90-minute session, looked at Logan and said plainly, "I can't solve it here. I'm sorry, I genuinely cannot identify the fault point." 23 mechanics, more than 6 hours. A combined experience base that could have staffed an engineering department. Nothing. The crowd had thinned somewhat. It was afternoon. The early enthusiasm had been replaced by a slower, more unsettled attention, and people with children or obligations had gradually filtered out. But the core remained the serious riders and mechanics and the people who had felt from the beginning that something important was happening here and hadn't been able to make themselves leave. Gerald, the MC, appeared at Logan's elbow, looking like a man who had been managing an unusual situation all day and wasn't entirely sure what the appropriate next step was. "Do you want to make an announcement? Maybe close out the mechanical portion and move to—" "No," Logan said. Gerald waited. "We keep going," Logan said. Logan 23. "I know how many." He wasn't sharp about it. He was just certain. "We keep going." It was Danny who noticed the kid first. He had been standing at the outer edge of the remaining crowd for at least an hour, which in retrospect several people would confirm, though none of them had paid him any particular attention at the time. He was 18 years old, though you might have placed him younger at a glance, medium height, lean in the way of someone who has been doing physical work since adolescence, wearing a gray t-shirt with an auto parts store logo that had been washed enough times to suggest it was a work uniform rather than a fashion choice. He had no tools, no bag, no kit, no case. He was just watching. Danny noticed him because of the way he was watching. Not with the varying attention of someone following a spectacle, the checking of phones, the side conversations, the wandering focus of crowd behavior. He was watching with a concentration that was almost uncomfortable to observe, the way you might watch a person read a document of critical importance when every line matters and the reader knows it. Danny walked over, not confrontationally, just curiously. "You a mechanic?" The kid looked at him. Clear eyes, no performance in his face. "I work at a gas station," he said. "Full service. I do repairs when they bring them in." Danny nodded slowly. "You want to take a look?" The kid was quiet for a moment, then, "I've been looking." "At what?" "At why they're all failing the same way." He paused. "None of them are wrong about what they're finding. They're just not asking the right question." Danny studied him. In 30 years of organizing rides and events and being adjacent to the motorcycle community, he had developed a reasonably reliable sense of the difference between confidence and competence, had seen enough young men confuse them to know the tells of the former performing as the latter. This kid wasn't performing. "Come with me," Danny said. He brought him to Logan. Logan still looked at the kid the way he looked at everything new, without prejudice, but without softness either. Evaluating. "You think you can find it," he said. The kid met his eyes. "I think I already have," he said. "I just need to confirm it." Somewhere behind them, someone in the crowd noticed that something had changed, that the man who had been standing at the center of this entire day was now in conversation with someone who was conspicuously not any of the 23 professionals who had preceded him, and the attention of the remaining crowd swung in their direction with the particular swiftness of a crowd that has been waiting for something new to happen. The kid walked to the Iron Beast and crouched beside her, and for 2 minutes and 47 seconds, someone would time it later because several people had their phones out, he did not touch her. He looked. He moved his eyes slowly from one system to the next, tracing connections, following lines, reading the physical logic of how Logan had assembled his life's work. The crowd was absolutely silent. Then the kid stood up and turned to Logan, and his voice was quiet enough that the people nearest to them had to lean in slightly to catch it, and calm enough that there was no mistaking it for anything other than a statement of fact. "There are 4 failure points," he said, "and none of them matter individually. They matter because they're talking to each other." He paused, and Logan's eyes were on him with an intensity that hadn't been there for any of the previous 23. "You've got a microfracture in your grounding circuit," the kid said. "Small enough that the diagnostic misses it because the resistance is still within acceptable range, barely but within it. Underneath that, your sensor timing has a conflict. It's been there since the firmware update in February, but the old fuel house vending was compensating for it mechanically without anyone knowing. When you replace the housing, you remove the compensation. Now the timing conflict is exposed. He took a breath. The exposed timing conflict is putting irregular demand signals into the ECU. The ECU is responding by defaulting to its firmware map for those conditions. But the firmware map doesn't match your engine's actual calibration. It never did, because this engine was built outside manufacturer spec. The firmware doesn't know this engine. So when the timing signal gets irregular, the ECU goes to its map. The map calls for parameters your engine can't meet, and the engine shuts down. Cleanly. No damage, just stops. Nobody spoke. The kid looked at the Iron Beast, then back at Logan. The fourth point is a stress fracture in the fuel housing. The new one. Hairline, you'd need light and magnification. It's not causing a fuel problem yet, but it's creating a pressure irregularity that's feeding back into the timing conflict and making the shutdown pattern consistent instead of intermittent. Without that fracture, the bike might start sometimes and fail other times. With it, the failure is locked in. Logan Steele was completely still. Behind them in the crowd, not a single person was talking. The kid straightened and looked at Logan with that same clear, unperformed directness he'd had from the moment Danny brought him over. The failures aren't separate, he said. They're a system, and the system is protecting itself. Somewhere in the crowd, a man who had been a mechanic for 31 years let out a long, slow breath that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Big Ray Cortez, from 20 feet away, was staring at the kid with an expression that no one who knew him had seen on his face before. And Logan Steele, who had built the Iron Beast with his own hands over 7 years, who had ridden her 112,000 miles, who had stood beside her for 6 hours while 23 of the best mechanics in the region failed to find what was wrong. Logan Steele looked at an 18-year-old gas station mechanic from a town most of them had never heard of and said nothing because for one of the very few times in his adult life, he had nothing to say. The kid was already reaching toward the Iron Beast. He hadn't asked for permission, and Logan hadn't withdrawn it. The crowd pressed closer, not with noise, but with the held breath of people who have been watching something build toward a moment for a very long time and can feel in the specific way that doesn't require words that the moment has arrived. His hands moved differently from everyone who had come before him. That was the first thing people noticed, not what he was doing, but how he was doing it. The 23 mechanics who had worked on the Iron Beast over the course of the day had each brought their own style, their own sequence, their own professional grammar of diagnosis. Some had been methodical to the point of being mechanical themselves, working through checklists with practiced efficiency. Others had brought the confident, slightly theatrical energy of experts who knew they were being watched. A few had been genuinely quiet, genuinely focused the way serious people get when a problem has their full respect. But Ethan Cole moved like someone who was having a conversation. Not with the crowd, not with Logan, not with Danny or Big Ray, or any of the people pressing forward from every available angle. He was in conversation with the Iron Beast herself, touching a connector, here pressing a line there, following a wire with 2 fingers the way you'd trace a sentence on a page when you wanted to make sure you hadn't missed a word. His face was the face of someone listening to something no one else could hear, and the particularity of it, the specificity, the absence of any wasted motion was so different from what had come before that it created its own silence around him. Logan Steele had not moved. He stood where he'd been standing when the kid finished his diagnosis and turned to the machine, and he was watching with the particular attention of a man who has built something with his own hands and is now watching a stranger touch it, not protectively, not anxiously, but with an acute awareness that whatever was about to happen was happening to something that mattered. Danny Reeves had positioned himself 3 feet to Logan's left, close enough to observe everything far enough to stay out of what felt increasingly like a defined space. He had his phone out not to film. He'd stopped thinking about documentation about an hour ago, but because holding it gave his hands something to do while his brain worked through the strangeness of the situation. Big Ray Cortesvar had moved closer without entirely meaning to. He was now 12 feet from the bike, close enough to see Ethan's hands clearly, and he was watching with the focused, evaluative attention of someone who understood exactly what the kid was doing and was running his own silent parallel assessment of whether each step was right. The crowd behind all of them had compressed. People who had been standing at comfortable distance were now close to pulled forward by the particular gravity of a moment that you can feel shifting even before you understand what it's shifting toward. Phones were out everywhere, but most of them weren't moving. People had them raised and then forgotten to film, absorbed by what was actually in front of them. Ethan had gone to the grounding circuit first. This made sense to anyone who'd been listening to his diagnosis, but the speed with which he found the exact location, not probing, not searching, going directly to a specific point on the frame, where the ground wire met the chassis, produced a visible reaction from the mechanics in the crowd who were close enough to track what he was doing. A man near the front, who had been one of the earlier failed attempts, actually took an involuntary step forward and then caught himself. He knew exactly where it was, the man said quietly to the person beside him. Not impressed yet, professionals process precision with professional caution, but acknowledging. Ethan pressed the ground connection with his thumb, testing resistance, then pulled from his back pocket a small multimeter, the basic kind, the kind that gas station mechanics use for starter tests and basic electrical checks, the kind that most of the professionals who'd preceded him would have considered inadequate for a job like this. He set the leads against 2 points on the ground circuit and waited 3 seconds for the reading to stabilize. He looked at the number, then he looked at the circuit. Then he said, without turning around, without directing the comment at anyone in particular, "There it is." Logan took 2 steps forward. "What?" Ethan held the multimeter so Logan could see the display. 0.4 ohms above nominal. It's inside the acceptable range barely. Your diagnostics would pass it every time. But under load with the other factors, this becomes the first domino. Logan looked at the number. His jaw moved slightly, not speaking, just processing. "The firmware update," Ethan said. He set the multimeter down and moved to the ECU housing, working the connections with careful, deliberate fingers. "February, you said. What version did they update to?" Logan said a number. Something crossed Ethan's face, not surprise exactly, but the expression of a theory encountering confirmation. "That version has a timing parameter change. Small one. The documentation buries it in the change log, 3rd page, line 40-something. Most shops don't read that deep." He paused, his fingers still working. "Your old fuel housing had a slight mechanical lag in its pressure response. That lag was accidentally compensating for the timing change, slowing the signal down enough that the ECU's new parameters didn't cause a conflict. When you replace the housing with the same spec unit, you got a housing that performs exactly as specified, which means the lag is gone, which means the timing conflict is no longer compensated." The mechanic near the front of the crowd who had stepped forward earlier said very quietly, "That's not possible to know from looking." The man beside him said, "He's not looking, he's reasoning." "From what data?" A pause. "I don't know." Logan was watching Ethan work the ECU connections with an expression that had moved past evaluation into something more unguarded. He had spent 61 years learning to read people, and what he was reading in Ethan Cole was something he recognized from a very small number of encounters across a very long life. The specific quality of a mind that was not performing intelligence, but simply expressing it, the way water expresses gravity without effort and without the option to do otherwise. "How do you know about the firmware change log?" Logan asked. Ethan's hands didn't stop moving. "I read everything I can find," he said. "I work at a gas station in Montana. We don't get bikes like this, but when I'm not doing repairs, I read. Service manuals, firmware, documentation, engineering bulletins, whatever I can get access to." A brief pause. "I read the change log for that firmware version because I found it interesting. The timing parameter adjustment was small enough that it wouldn't matter for most builds. But I remember thinking that it would matter for a custom build with non-standard fuel delivery timing." He seated a connector firmly and moved to the next. "I didn't think I'd ever actually see it in the field." The silence around this statement was of a specific quality, not stunned exactly, but weighted. The information was reorganizing itself in people's minds, and the reorganization was producing something that felt less like amazement and more like a kind of sorrow. An 18-year-old in a gas station in Montana reading firmware documentation in his spare time, accumulating knowledge that he had no obvious way to apply because the machines he had access to would never surface the problem that knowledge was built to solve. Big Ray Cortez exhaled slowly through his nose. He didn't say anything, but his arms, which had been crossed since he moved closer, came down to his sides. Danny Reeves turned to look at Logan and found that Logan was not looking back at him. Logan's full attention was on Ethan, and the quality of that attention was not something Danny could remember seeing on Logan Steele's face directed at another person. Not deference. Logan Steele did not defer, but something close to recognition. The recognition of a peer, which was the more surprising of the two because the peer was less than a third of his age. Ethan had moved to the fuel housing now. He took a small pen light from his front pocket, the kind that costs $4 at a hardware store, and angled it along the surface of the housing, with his other hand moving it slowly, watching the light change as it crossed the material. He stopped. "Got a magnifier," he said over his shoulder. Someone in the crowd produced one within 15 seconds, an older man with the careful pockets of someone who attended events like this because they genuinely loved the mechanical world and came prepared for it. He handed it over without a word. Ethan put the magnifier over a specific point on the housing and looked through it for a long moment. Then he handed the magnifier back and said to Logan, "Hairline fracture, about here." He indicated the location with one finger. "It's not leaking, won't leak for a while yet, but it's changing the pressure signature just enough to create a feedback loop that makes the ECU shutdown consistent." He stood up. "Without that fracture," he said, "this bike would be failing intermittently. You'd start it sometimes to get 30 seconds of run time, it would cut out. You'd start it again, it might run, might not. The pattern would be maddening and almost impossible to diagnose because the root causes are different each time." He looked at Logan directly. "The fracture is actually the reason 23 mechanics couldn't solve it. It made the failure too consistent. Everyone went looking for a single catastrophic cause because random failures from multiple interacting causes don't typically produce a perfectly consistent shutdown pattern. The fracture locked the system into one failure mode, and everyone assumed that meant one failure point." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the mechanic near the front said loudly enough for a significant portion of the crowd to hear, "He's right, he's completely right. That's exactly why we were all failing." This statement moved through the crowd differently than previous statements had. It wasn't the interest of people watching a spectacle. It was the particular electricity of recognition of people who had been observing something they couldn't fully process, suddenly being given the frame that made it legible. The conversations that broke out were rapid, urgent people turning to each other and running through what they just heard against what they'd watched over the preceding 6 hours. Big Ray was now 7 feet from the bike. He had moved without deciding to. He looked at Ethan and said in the tone of a man asking something that matters, "How long to fix it?" Ethan thought about it, not performing the thought, actually doing the calculation, running through the sequence of corrections and the time each would require. 45 minutes, he said, maybe an hour. Ray nodded. "What do you need?" And here was the thing that several people would talk about for years afterward. The detail that accumulated meaning in retrospect. Ethan Cole listed what he needed, and it was almost nothing. A few specific tools, a replacement ground wire of a particular gauge, an ECU reset cable, sealant compound for the housing. He did not ask for a machine. He did not ask for a diagnostic system worth more than most people's cars. He did not ask for the kind of specialized equipment that had arrived with the professionals carried in cases with foam cutouts holding each piece. He asked for what a working mechanic in a real shop would have on hand. Someone produced everything he needed within 6 minutes. Various people from the crowd supplying different items, passing them forward through the compressed cluster of bodies. There was something almost instinctive about the way the crowd responded, not because they'd been asked, but because the situation had developed its own logic, and participating in it felt like the obvious thing to do. Ethan went to work. The first thing he did was repair the ground circuit, and he did it in a way that made 2 professional mechanics in the immediate area lean toward each other with the specific body language of people comparing observations. The repair itself was not complicated. It was a section of wire and a connection, but the way he managed the physical work, the angle he chose, the way he stripped and set the wire, was the particular expression of someone who has done physical work in real conditions, not controlled ones. His hands were efficient without being rushed. He didn't look at what they were doing half the time, which meant his attention was on what came next, which meant he was sequencing already running ahead of his hands, preparing the next problem for the hands to solve when they caught up. Danny watched this and felt something he couldn't immediately name. It took him a moment to identify it as grief or the near relative of grief. The recognition that a thing of genuine value has been in the wrong place. That capacity has been wasted, not out of anyone's malice, but simply because the world has terrible aim when it comes to placing talent where it can do what it is built to do. Logan had been aware of this for longer. Logan had been aware of it since the kid opened his mouth. "Where did you say you're from?" Logan asked. He kept his voice conversational, not intrusive, the tone of someone asking something that seems simple but isn't. "Malta, Montana," Ethan said. He was working the ECU connections now, his penlight clamped in his teeth, so both hands were free. "Population roughly 2,000, parents us." A brief pause. The penlight came out of his teeth. "My dad has a garage, general repairs, mostly farm equipment, some vehicles. He's been running it alone since I was 12. He receded the ECU cable with a precise click. "My mom passed when I was 9. No performance in the way he said it, just the plain fact of it offered without invitation for sympathy, which made it land harder than any performance would have." Logan said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your dad know you're here?" "I'm supposed to be working," Ethan said. "I took a bus." "You took a bus from Montana to Riverside?" "I heard about the ride 3 weeks ago, saw the specs on the Iron Beast online." The pen light went back between his teeth. He kept working. "Why Brekamas?" Logan asked. The pen light came out again. Ethan looked at Logan for a moment, a direct look, no deflection, no social navigation. "Because I'd never seen a machine like this in person," he said. "And I wanted to understand how something could be built this well." He paused. "I wasn't expecting it to break." Something in the crowd shifted at this. Not loudly, there was no moment of collective response, no surge of noise. It was quieter than that. It was the particular internal shift of a large number of people encountering a truth that had not been decorated. Big Ray had his arms at his sides and his eyes on the kid, and an expression on his face that his own chapter members would not have recognized because it was the expression of a man confronting the full weight of something he had almost missed. "He rode a bus," someone in the crowd said. Not mockingly, just processing it. "He rode a bus to look at the bike," someone else confirmed. This detail for reasons that probably had more to do with what it meant than what it was seemed to matter to the crowd in a way that the diagnosis hadn't. The diagnosis was impressive. The diagnosis required knowledge and reasoning and a quality of seeing that most people in the crowd couldn't access directly. But riding a bus from Montana because you heard about a machine you'd never seen and wanted to understand how it was built, that was something that didn't require translation. Ethan had moved to the ECU itself, now working through the firmware recalibration process with a methodical patience that stood in direct contrast to the pace of his diagnostic phase. He explained each step briefly without being asked, which some people later thought was the most quietly confident thing about him. He narrated because he understood the room, not because he needed to demonstrate. "I'm mapping the ECU back to the engine's actual calibration parameters," he said. "The firmware has a base map and it has learned parameters. The firmware update reset the learned parameters to match the new base map, which made sense for every engine the manufacturer intended this system to run. It doesn't make sense for this engine." He worked without looking up. "I'm going to reset the base map to a custom calibration that matches what Mr. Steele's engine actually needs. That means I need the engine's spec sheet." Logan produced it from a document folder he kept in his jacket. He always kept it. This was the kind of man he was. Ethan took it, read it in 60 seconds, which was itself notable, and went back to work. There were 12 minutes in the middle of this process when nothing appeared to be happening from the outside. Ethan was working through a software interface on a cable-connected tablet, making small adjustments, checking, adjusting again. And this was the hardest 12 minutes for the crowd, because watching someone navigate a software menu is not visually compelling, and the absence of visible progress created space for doubt to re-enter. It re-entered loudly for some people. "This could still be nothing," a man toward the back said in the particular tone of someone who has been emotionally invested and is preparing an exit. "The diagnosis could be right and the repair could still fail." "You're not wrong," the man beside him agreed. 23 professionals couldn't fix it." "He's not a professional." "Exactly." But closer in among the mechanics and the serious riders, this conversation wasn't happening. They had been watching Ethan's hands and the logic connecting each action to the next, and what they were watching was internally coherent in the way that genuine competence always is, each step following from the last, with a cleanness that made the sequence feel inevitable rather than chosen. Professionals can read this. They can't always explain what they're reading, but they can feel the difference between someone working toward a solution and someone performing the movements of working toward a solution. Danny Reeves had been watching the crowd as much as the bike, and what he was watching in the crowd was a story of its own. People who had been half present for hours were fully present now. People who had drifted to the edges were back. The social media contingent who had been narrating the event to external audiences had largely gone quiet in the last 20 minutes, not because they'd stopped filming, but because they'd been drawn in and their running commentary had dried up, replaced by the silence of people who have stopped being reporters because they have become participants in something. When Ethan finished the ECU calibration and moved to the fuel housing, the ground circuit wire already set, the ECU cable stowed, the sequence of corrections progressing exactly as he'd described them. Ray Cortez said to no one in particular, in a voice barely above a conversational volume, "He's going to do it." Nobody questioned this. Nobody challenged it. Not even the man at the back who had been preparing his exit. The housing sealant went on with a precision that drew a comment from the gas station regular who had provided the magnifier, an older man named Harold, who had been a machinist for 30 years before retiring, and who attended these rides because his late wife had loved motorcycles, and being around them made him feel close to her still. Harold watched Ethan apply the sealant and said quietly, "That's the right bead width, and he's feathering the edge correctly. You don't teach that. You develop that." Nobody knew Harold well enough to understand what it meant that Harold had said this. But the man standing next to Harold happened to know that Harold had spent 30 years developing a reputation for the kind of precision material work that the aerospace industry paid for, and he leaned slightly away to tell this to the person on his other side, and the information moved outward through the crowd in the particular way that relevant context spreads when it can change the meaning of what people are watching. Ethan stepped back from the housing and waited 30 seconds for the sealant to set. He used the time to go over each previous repair point, visually checking each one, running his fingers along the ground wire, checking the ECU connections, moving through the sequence in reverse to confirm nothing had been disturbed. Then he looked at Logan. "You want a starter," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Logan looked at him for a moment. Then he said no. Ethan waited. "You do it," Logan said. This created a sound in the crowd, not loud, not theatrical, but real. The sound of people registering the weight of what Logan Steele had just said. Logan Steele did not let other people start the Iron Beast. This was known. It was one of the understood things about the man and his machine, part of the specific code of a person who has built something across years and maintains a particular relationship with it. Ethan held Logan's eyes for a moment. Then he nodded once and turned to the machine. He did not make a moment of it. He reached for the key with the same matter-of-fact quality he'd brought to every other action in the past hour. No ceremony, no theatrical pause. He checked the choke set. The throttle pumped the primer twice. Then he turned the key. The starter motor engaged. The first cylinder fired. The second caught. The engine turned over, once caught its breath, and then the Iron Beast opened up, not sputtering back to life in the tentative way of a machine that has been ill and is recovering, but with the full immediate authority of something that had been held wrongly and was now suddenly right. The sound of her hit the crowd like a physical force, and the physical force of it broke something loose in the people who had been standing there, holding themselves in check for 6 hours. The roar from the crowd hit at almost exactly the same moment as the engines, the two sounds crashing together in a way that was chaotic and immediate and completely without organization. People who had maintained professional composure all day, losing it in an instant. Men who had been folding their arms and watching with careful neutrality, suddenly making sounds they hadn't planned to make. The Hells Angels contingent, whose collective attention had been the quietest and most sustained throughout Ray Cortez, and his group erupting with a volume and abandon that nobody standing near them would have predicted based on the previous 6 hours. Danny Reeves turned away from the crowd and pressed his hand briefly against his face. Logan Steele stood completely still and listened to his machine run. She ran clean. She ran exactly the way she had run at 6:45 that morning in the hotel parking lot when Logan had started her up before the day began, and before he had any reason to expect the day would be anything other than a good charity ride. The idle was steady. The response when he touched the throttle was immediate and smooth, And the sound was the sound that 112,000 miles and 7 years of his life had built toward. The mechanic near the front of the crowd, who had been the most vocal throughout the process, was doing something that he would later deny, and that multiple people would confirm he was crying with the particular bewildered expression of someone who had not anticipated the depth of his own emotional response to a machine starting. Harold, the retired machinist, stood very still with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that no one around him could read. He was thinking about his wife. He was not sure why, but he was, and it felt appropriate. Big Ray Cortez walked to Ethan Cole and stopped in front of him. He was 8 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier and had been riding since before Ethan was born, and he looked at this kid who had taken a bus from Montana and done in 47 minutes what 23 professionals couldn't do in 6 hours, and he put out his hand. Ethan took it. Ray didn't say anything immediately. He held the handshake for a moment looking at Ethan, and then he said, "Where'd you learn to think like that?" Ethan looked at him. "My dad," he said. "He always said the failure is never in the part. It's in what the part forgot to talk to." Ray was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your dad's right." He released Ethan's hand and stepped back, and something had changed in the configuration of the space around Ethan. The informal physical grammar of the crowd had rearranged itself without discussion, people creating a different relationship to where he was standing, which was no longer the periphery of something, but the center. Logan shut the engine down. The sudden silence after the roar had a texture of its own. He turned to Ethan, and the crowd went quiet the way crowds do when the person who has been at the center of everything is about to speak. Logan said $5.4 million. Ethan looked at him without flinching, without the wide-eyed shock that the crowd might have expected from an 18-year-old gas station mechanic from Malta, Montana, being offered more money than most people see in a lifetime. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that nobody who was there would forget. "I need to call my dad first," he said. "He doesn't know where I am." The laughter that came from the crowd, genuine, warm, helpless, broke what remained of the day's tension completely. Even Logan Steele, who was not a man who smiled easily in public, showed something on his face that the people nearest him recognized as the real thing. But beneath the laughter, something was still working in the room. Something that the laughter couldn't quite cover, and that would be harder to name and would take longer to resolve than any of what had happened to the Iron Beast. Because $5.4 million was one answer. But the question of how an 18-year-old with a pen light and a $4 multimeter had walked up to a machine that had defeated every professional in the room and solved it in under 3 minutes of looking, that question wasn't funny. That question was the kind that changes the way you think about things if you let it. And there were people in that crowd who were already letting it. Danny Reeves was one of them. He had moved to stand beside Logan, and he said quietly while the crowd was still processing the laughter, "What do we do now?" Logan was watching Ethan, who had stepped a few feet away and had his phone to his ear, presumably calling his father with the expression of a young man who is about to have a conversation that is going to be very surprising for the person on the other end of it. "I don't know yet," Logan said, which from Logan Steele was not an admission of confusion. It was the statement of a man who had just encountered something he hadn't fully mapped yet and was being honest about the gap. He watched the kid on the phone. He watched the crowd beginning to decompress, beginning to process, beginning to do what crowds do after a moment like this, not leave it behind, but carry it forward, looking for people to tell. The Iron Beast sat between them running a few minutes ago and now still restored and waiting. And Logan Steele thought about what Ray had passed along the kid's father's line, the one about the failure never being in the part, only in what the part forgot to talk to. He turned it over in his mind the way you turn over a statement that has landed somewhere real. Then he thought about a garage in Malta, Montana running on fumes, and a man who had raised a son who could see systems while everyone else saw parts. And Logan Steele, who had not made a decision impulsively in 30 years, felt one forming. The phone rang 4 times before James Cole picked up. Ethan had stepped away from the immediate crowd, maybe 20 feet, not because he needed privacy, but because he needed a second to figure out how to start the conversation. He had been gone since Thursday. It was now Saturday afternoon. His father had covered his shifts at the gas station himself, which meant James Cole had been working 16-hour days without asking where his son was, because James Cole was the kind of man who believed that people who needed to go somewhere had their reasons and that asking too soon was a form of pressure disguised as concern. Hey, Ethan said when the line connected. A pause, then his father's voice dry and careful, the way it always was, the voice of a man who had learned not to lead with emotion, because emotion cost energy, and energy was a resource you managed. You alive, Omo. Yeah. Okay. Another pause. In the background, Ethan could hear the shop, the particular ambient sound of a garage that never fully went quiet, metal and air, and the low hum of the compressor that his father had been meaning to replace for 3 years. You need money. No. Ethan looked back at the crowd, at the Iron Beast sitting between them all like a fact nobody had fully processed yet. Dad, I'm in Riverside. Silence. California, Ethan added, though his father knew exactly one Riverside, and it was not in Montana. The silence extended for 4 more seconds, which from James Cole was the equivalent of a long speech. Then the charity ride. Yeah. The steel bike. Yeah. Another pause. Ethan could hear his father breathing the particular slow breath of a man doing arithmetic, adding up the bus fare and the days and the distance and arriving at a number that should have been alarming, but wasn't quite because the math of who his son was had always produced unusual sums. Did you get close enough to see it? I fixed it, Ethan said. The silence this time was different. It had a different texture, not the silence of processing, but the silence of a man whose internal framework has just been asked to accommodate something that doesn't fit the existing structure. Say that again, James said. It broke down at the display. Nobody could fix it for 6 hours. I looked at it and I fixed it. A beat. It's running now. More silence. Then very quietly, in the voice that Ethan had only heard his father use 2 or 3 times in his entire life, once when Ethan's mother died, once when the bank called about the garage loan, once when Ethan was 11 and had rebuilt a carburetor correctly the first time without being shown, James Cole said, "How bad was the fault?" And this was the thing that broke Ethan open a little, standing 20 feet from the largest crowd he'd ever been in front of. Not the money, not the applause, not Ray Cortez's handshake, or Logan Steele's expression. His father's first question was about the mechanical problem. Not about the money, not about whether Ethan was in trouble, not about the bus ticket or the missed shifts, about the fault, about what had been broken and how. Because James Cole understood that this was what mattered, that the rest was circumstance. The machine was the point, Ethan told him. He walked through the 4 failure points the same way he described them to Logan. The grounding circuit, the firmware timing conflict, the compensation that the old housing had been providing, without anyone knowing the stress fracture that had locked the failure pattern into a consistent shutdown. He talked for 4 minutes without interruption, and his father listened without interruption, which was how they had always talked about mechanical problems, with the complete mutual respect of 2 people who take the subject seriously. When Ethan finished, James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The firmware documentation. 3rd page of the changelog. You read that in February. March, actually." A sound from his father that might have been the beginning of a laugh checked before it could become one. "All right," James said. "Then there's something else." "Yeah," Ethan said. "He's offering the reward." "How much?" Ethan told him. The silence that followed this number was the longest silence of the conversation. Ethan waited it out, watching the crowd from a distance, watching Danny Reeves and Logan talking, watching Big Ray standing with his group, but angled toward where Ethan was standing, maintaining a peripheral attention that Ethan had noticed and that made him feel something he couldn't quite name, not watched exactly, more like regarded. "Ethan," his father said finally, "yeah, that's more money than this garage has made in 20 years. I know. That's more money than—" James stopped, started again. "That's a number that changes things." "I know, Dad." Another pause. Then James Cole did something Ethan had not expected. He said, "What do you want to do with it? Not take it and come home. Not be careful. Not don't do anything stupid." He asked what Ethan wanted to do because James Cole, for all the ways the world had compressed his options over 20 years of running a failing garage in a small Montana town, had never once made his son feel that wanting something was naive. "I want to fix the garage," Ethan said, "and I want to, He stopped. The rest of it was too large to say on a phone in a parking lot in California. "I'll tell you when I get home." "Okay," James said. Then with a particular careful lightness of a man who is feeling something large and does not want to burden his son with it, "Bus or plane on the way back?" Ethan almost smiled. Probably plane. Good, James said. The bus takes too long. The compressor made a bad sound this morning. And that was the end of the conversation. No declaration, no tears, just a father and son who understood each other in the specific language of machines and work, and the quiet love of people who show it by staying present rather than saying so. Ethan put his phone in his pocket and walked back to Logan Steele. Logan had been watching him without making it obvious, which was something Logan was good at. He had the patience of a man who had built a 640-pound machine over 7 years and understood that the things worth waiting for required the actual waiting. "Your dad all right?" Logan asked. "He wants to know about the fault," Ethan said. "I'll give him the full breakdown when I'm back." Logan nodded. "The money," he said. "We need to talk about the money." "Okay, not right now." Logan looked at the crowd, which was beginning to reassemble itself. People who had drifted away during the repair, returning new people who had heard second and third-hand accounts arriving the event, beginning to reconstitute itself around a different center of gravity than it had started with. "Right now, I want you to meet some people." What followed over the next 90 minutes was not something Ethan had prepared for because it was not something he could have prepared for. It was the particular experience of becoming, in the span of a single afternoon, the thing that a large group of people needed to believe in. The mechanics came first. Not all 23 some had left their professional dignity, requiring departure, before the situation became something they would have to position themselves relative to publicly. But 8 of them had stayed, including Tom Harrington from Phoenix, Paul Becker from San Diego, and the retired aerospace engineer, whose name was Gerald Fitch, and who had watched Ethan's entire repair process from a distance of 6 feet without saying a single word. Harrington approached first because Harrington was the kind of man who processed things quickly and moved on them before the processing was complete. He extended his hand and Ethan took it, and Harrington said without preamble, "The firmware change log. I have never read past the first page of a firmware change log in my life." Ethan looked at him. "Most of it isn't relevant," he said, "but some of it is, and you don't know which parts until you've read all of it." Harrington absorbed this. "I've been building custom bikes for 22 years. "I know," Ethan said. "I've read about some of your builds, the twin-engine piece in Cycle World." Something shifted in Harrington's expression, not vanity responding to flattery, but a more complicated thing, the particular adjustment of a person who has just been reminded that being seen has dimensions they hadn't considered. "You read that. The engineering approach was interesting. The frame geometry solution you used for the weight distribution problem." Ethan paused. "I had a question about that actually, if you have time." Harrington stared at him for a moment. Then he said to no one in particular, "He has a question about my weight distribution solution." He shook his head slowly. "Yeah, I have time." Paul Becker was less immediately expansive, but more genuinely moved, which expressed itself as a kind of careful, deliberate respect, the respect of a man who takes his craft seriously enough that encountering a superior expression of it doesn't threaten him, because his love of the craft is bigger than his investment in his own position within it. He told Ethan that he had diagnosed the timing conflict as a possibility early in his session, but had dismissed it because the housing replacement was too recent to have created a compensatory relationship that the machine had come to depend on. "That was my mistake," he said. "I assumed the compensation was too new to be structural. But it doesn't take long, does it? Once a system starts adapting to something, it adapts fast." "Sometimes within a few hundred miles," Ethan said, "especially in fuel delivery systems. They're sensitive." Becker nodded slowly with the expression of a man revising an assumption he had held for a decade. "I'm going to start reading change logs," he said. Gerald Fitch, the aerospace engineer, said nothing to Ethan during this period. He stood at a slight distance, watching, and when his eyes met Ethan's, once briefly unplanned, he gave a single small nod that carried with it the compressed weight of 30 years of precision work and the recognition of its like in someone else. It was enough. Ethan understood it. Big Ray came back. He came with 2 other Hells Angels members, both of whom had been watching the repair from different positions in the crowd and who had not yet spoken directly to Ethan. Ray made no introduction. He simply arrived and stood, and his presence was introduction enough. "I want to ask you something," Ray said. "Go ahead." "The moment you looked at the bike, before you touched anything, 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Ray paused. What were you actually seeing? It was a serious question from a serious man, and Ethan treated it that way. He thought about it for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer lived in a place that was slightly below the level of words, and he had to bring it up carefully. I was looking at the logic of how it was assembled, he said, not the individual components, the relationships, what each part was in conversation with, and what those conversations were producing. He paused. When you understand a system well enough, the failure tells you about itself in the shape of what's still working. Everything that's working and is working around something that isn't. If you can see what the working parts are working around, you can see the shape of the failure before you identify the failure itself. Ray was quiet for a moment. One of the men behind him said quietly, "That's not how they teach mechanics." "No," Ethan agreed, "it's not. Where did you learn it?" Ethan thought about his father's garage, about the farm equipment and the half-broken trucks and the machines that came in with no documentation and no previous repair history and had to be understood from first principles because there was nobody to call and no service manual that covered this exact iteration of this exact problem. About the years of being the kid who handed tools and then the kid who asked questions and then the kid who started answering them before his father finished asking. "My dad taught me to ask why something is still running," he said, "not just why it stopped. Most diagnosis focuses on the failure point, but everything around the failure point is still working, and it's working in response to the failure it's adapted. If you read the adaptation, you can find the failure faster." Ray looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been a mechanic for 30 years, and I have never heard anyone say that." "Most people figure it out eventually," Ethan said. "They just don't always have words for it." "You have words for it at 18. Ethan didn't respond to this. There wasn't much to say. He had the words because his father had given him the framework, and he had spent years filling it with reading and thinking and the particular practice of working on machines that nobody else had fixed in a town where if you didn't fix it, nobody would. Logan Steele had been listening to this exchange from 4 feet away, and something was consolidating in him. The decision that had been forming since he watched Ethan on the phone with his father was taking on edges, becoming specific rather than general. He had spent his career building things with precision, and the same instinct that told him when a part was right told him when a person was. He had learned to trust this instinct across 61 years of being almost always right about it. He waited until Ray's group had moved slightly away, not far, just enough to give the conversation a different shape. Then he said to Ethan, "Tell me about the garage." Ethan looked at him. "What do you want to know?" "Everything your dad hasn't told you to say to someone like me." This was a specific kind of request, and Ethan recognized it as such. Logan was not asking for a pitch. He was asking for the truth beneath the version of the truth that a person constructs when they're trying to make something sound better than it is. Ethan told him. The garage had been his grandfather's first a general repair shop that had served Malta and the surrounding farming communities for 30 years before James took it over. When James took it over, it had been healthy, a reliable local institution with a steady customer base and reasonable equipment. Then the farm economy shifted. Then a larger chain shop opened in the nearest city with better equipment and manufacturer warranties. Then Ethan's mother got sick. And the combination of these things over 8 years had turned a healthy business into a surviving one, and then into one that was surviving badly. James had not gone under. This was the thing that mattered about James Cole, and the thing that Ethan said with a particular weight: his father had not gone under. He had reduced his own salary to almost nothing, had worked the hours of 2 men, had maintained his reputation for honesty and quality in a community that was small enough for reputation to be the only currency that actually transferred, and he had kept the doors open. But the equipment was old. The building needed work. 3 of the 6 service bays were effectively non-functional because the hydraulic lifts needed repairs that James couldn't afford without taking on debt he couldn't service. And James was 54 years old and had been running at this pace for 12 years, and he was the kind of man who would keep running it until he physically couldn't. Logan listened to all of this without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Logan said, "What would it take to fix it?" "Actually fix it, not patch it, fix it." Ethan had thought about this. He had been thinking about it on the bus from Montana somewhere in Idaho when the landscape had gone flat and dark, and he'd had nothing to do but look at the ceiling of the bus and run numbers. The lifts are about 40,000. New alignment system is another 25. The building needs about 60,000 in structural work. Equipment diagnostic systems tooling another 80 to 100 depending. He paused. Call it 250,000 to turn it into a real shop, the kind that can compete. Logan nodded. And what would you do with a real shop? Ethan was quiet for a moment. This was the part he hadn't said to his father on the phone because the parking lot in Riverside wasn't the right place. But Logan Steele had asked directly and with the full weight of someone who intended to do something with the answer. Train people, Ethan said. Young ones. Kids from the area who have mechanical instinct but nowhere to develop it. Teach them what my dad taught me, not just how to fix what's broken, but how to understand why systems fail. How to see the whole picture. He paused. There's a lot of people in small towns with good minds and no place to put them. I was one of them. I got lucky. I happened to hear about a charity ride in California, and I happened to have enough money for a bus ticket. He looked at Logan directly. Most people with the same capacity don't get that kind of coincidence. Logan Steele was very still. He had heard a lot of things in his 61 years. He had heard impressive things and smart things and occasionally brilliant things. He had heard people articulate visions with clarity and passion and organizational precision. He had built something himself that required all of those qualities across 7 years. But he had not often heard an 18-year-old in a gray gas station t-shirt describe a problem that was genuinely large at the waste of potential in places the economy had stopped looking at with the same calm specificity that he brought to a 4-part mechanical diagnosis. Without performance. Without the energy of someone trying to sound bigger than they were. Just the thing itself stated plainly because it was true and because the person being talked to had asked. I want to talk to your father, Logan said. Ethan looked at him. Why Somo? Because whatever you are, he built it, Logan said. And I want to understand how. The crowd had reconstituted itself into something different from what it had been in the morning. It was smaller but more concentrated, the casual spectators having filtered out, and what remained being the people who had felt from the beginning that something real was happening and who had stayed because leaving felt like abandoning something they couldn't name. Gerald, the MC, had navigated the afternoon with the skill of a man who understood that his job was not to control the event, but to hold space for it to be present and useful without inserting himself into a moment that had developed its own authority. He appeared at Logan's side now, not intrusively, with the practiced invisibility of experienced event management. The charity total, he said quietly to Logan. With the pledge you made this morning, we're at levels we've never seen. The sponsors have been calling. 3 of them have asked about increasing their commitment. Logan absorbed this without changing expression. Good, he said. That's what this was supposed to be. Gerald nodded and withdrew. But the moment had been observed by Danny, who processed it and added it to the accumulating picture of the day. The charity had always been the point. This was the thing people sometimes forgot about Logan Steele in the narrative of the Iron Beast and the reward in the drama of the afternoon. The ride was not vanity. It had never been vanity. The machine was the draw, the drama was the draw, but the money at the end of the day went to veterans organizations and local support programs, and it went there in amounts that Logan quietly made certain were significant. The reward had not been a performance. It had been a genuine offer made in a moment of genuine challenge, and the fact that Ethan Cole had earned it was something that Logan had processed with a kind of satisfaction that went beyond the mechanical. The right person had won. In a day that could have been a humiliation and had flirted with it in the laughter and the social media commentary, and the 23 failures the right person had won. Ray Cortez had been talking with his group, and now he separated from them and came back to where Logan and Ethan were standing. He had the body language of someone who has made a decision. I want to propose something, he said. He was looking at Logan, but he addressed it to include Ethan. The San Bernardino chapter has a shop. We've got space and equipment, and we've got 12 guys who know bikes the way they know their own hands. He paused. We also have kids in our community who we're trying to keep pointed in the right direction, and we don't always have the right tools for that. He looked at Ethan now. What you're describing, the training, the mentorship, that's something we've been trying to do and doing poorly. Not because of will, because of the model. He paused again longer this time. I'm not saying I know what the right arrangement looks like, but I'm saying I want to be in the conversation. The silence after this was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of three people who had each arrived at this afternoon from very different directions and had somehow landed in the same place, which was the place where something new was possible. And none of them had the specific shape of that something yet, but all of them could feel its outline. Ethan looked at Ray. He said, "What do the kids in your community know how to do?" Ray considered this. "They know how to work. They know how to show up. A lot of them have mechanical instinct they have never had formally developed." He paused. "Some of them have been in trouble. Some of them are in the process of not being in trouble anymore. They need something to be serious about." "Serious is the right word," Ethan said. "The way I want to teach it, it's not casual. You have to understand why, not just how. It takes longer and it requires more from the student, but it produces something that lasts." Ray nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm describing." Logan had been listening with the quality of attention he brought to the Iron Beast. When he was working through a complex problem, not passive, not observational, but actively absorbing, integrating, testing the internal logic of what he was hearing against his own structural understanding. He said, "The money we're talking about here is enough to do this right, not patch it, do it right, equipment, space-time, a curriculum that's been thought through." He looked at Ethan. "But I want you to understand something." Ethan waited. "Money solves the resource problem," Logan said. "It doesn't solve the knowledge problem. The reason what you did today was possible is because of something your father spent 18 years building in you. You can't buy that. You can create conditions where it's more likely to develop, but you can't buy it." He paused. "I've spent a lot of my life being around people who thought resources were the answer. Resources are necessary. They're not sufficient." "I know," Ethan said. "Do you?" "My dad's garage has almost no resources," Ethan said, "and it produced this conversation." He met Logan's eyes. "Resources would let us reach more people, but the model that produces the result, that's not about resources. That's about what you teach and how you teach it, and whether the person teaching it genuinely believes that understanding matters more than speed." Logan looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to Ray. "He's right," he said. Ray didn't look surprised. He had been listening and he had arrived at the same place, and his expression showed the particular equanimity of a man who respects an argument when he hears one, regardless of who's making it. What happened over the next hour was not dramatic in the way the morning had been dramatic. It was the quieter drama of people working out the first rough shape of something real. Logan making calls, Danny taking notes on his phone, Ray conferring with his group, and then returning with confirmations. Ethan answering questions about the Montana garage with a precision that periodically made the people asking the questions stop and look at each other. Tom Harrington came back during this period and asked if he could be part of whatever was being built in whatever capacity was useful. Not for credit, he was clear about that, but because he had spent 22 years as the kind of mechanic who built impressive things and had realized in the last 3 hours that impressive was a ceiling he hadn't examined closely enough. Gerald Fitch, the aerospace engineer, appeared at Ethan's elbow and handed him a business card and said simply, "If you ever want to understand why the firmware timing parameters were set, the way they were, the engineering decision behind the decision, call me. It's a longer conversation than today allows." Ethan took the card. "I'd like that," he said. Fitch nodded once and walked away, and he was smiling in a way that nobody around him would have recognized as unusual for Gerald Fitch, because nobody around him had ever seen Gerald Fitch smile. The media had been present through all of this, and the story they were assembling was the story that would appear in various forms with various frames across platforms over the following days. But the story they were assembling was a version of the truth shaped by what cameras could capture and what angles produced compelling footage and what narrative structure was legible to an audience that had not been present. The real story was happening in the conversation between three men: a 61-year-old who had built his life's work with his own hands, a 30-year veteran of a riding culture that the world mostly misread, and an 18-year-old from a town most people had never heard of, who had read a firmware changelog in March because he found it interesting. The real story was about what gets wasted when the world doesn't have the right eyes in the right places, and what becomes possible when the coincidences line up a machine that breaks at the exact right moment in front of the exact right crowd with the exact right person standing at the edge of it. Danny had been quiet for a while, managing logistics and fielding the calls that Logan was generating, and he came back to Logan's side during a brief break in the conversation and said in the particular tone of someone who is about to ask something he isn't sure is appropriate, "Does he know what's happening to him right now?" Logan looked at Ethan, who was talking to Ray about the specifics of the San Bernardino chapter's shop equipment with the same attentive focus he'd brought to every other technical conversation of the afternoon. "No," Logan said, "not yet. Should we tell him?" Logan thought about it. "Then his dad will tell him when he gets home and sits in the garage and the noise of today has gone quiet." He paused. "His dad will tell him in the way his dad tells him things, by asking the right question and then listening while the kid figures it out." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a better way than us telling him in a parking lot." Danny nodded slowly. "How do you know that's how his dad tells him things?" Logan looked at the kid one more time. "Because of the way the kid thinks," he said simply, and then something happened that none of them had anticipated. A woman pushed through the outer edge of the crowd, not aggressively, but with the focused determination of someone who has covered distance to get somewhere and doesn't intend to be stopped at the final moment. She was in her mid-40s, professionally dressed in the slightly strained way of someone who had dressed for a different event and had been standing in a parking lot for hours. She had a press credential around her neck and a recorder in her hand, and the expression of a journalist who has spent an afternoon watching something she cannot entirely frame. She stopped in front of Ethan. "My name is Sarah Okafor," she said. "I'm doing a piece for a national outlet. I've been here since this morning." She paused. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know it's not a gotcha, it's a genuine question." Ethan looked at her. "Okay." 23 professional mechanics failed," she said. "Men with decades of experience and thousands of dollars of equipment. You walked up with a $4 flashlight and you fixed it in 47 minutes. She paused. "What do you think that says, not about you, about the system?" The crowd around them had gone quiet, not because they'd been signaled to, but because the question had the particular quality of something that everyone present had been trying to formulate for hours, and hearing it said aloud created the specific silence of collective recognition. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the Iron Beast, then he looked back at Sarah Okafor. "It says that expertise is not the same as understanding," he said, "and that the way we teach people to fix things focuses on what breaks, not on how systems fail." He paused. "Every one of those mechanics knew more than me about the individual components. They knew more about Harley specifications and ECU systems and fuel delivery engineering. I don't doubt that for a second." He looked at the bike again. "But knowing parts is not the same as knowing relationships, and most mechanical training teaches parts." Sarah was writing quickly. Around them, phones were raised. "And where did you learn relationships?" she asked. "My dad's garage," Ethan said, "on machines nobody else would touch, with no manual and no diagnostic system and no other choice except to understand." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without the consciousness of how it would land, which was precisely why it landed the way it did. Sarah lowered her recorder slightly, then she raised it again. "One more question," she said. "What happens now?" Ethan looked at Logan. Logan looked back at him. "We make a phone call," Ethan said, "to my dad." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, and the crowd watched him, and the Iron Beast sat between all of them, restored and still, and the late afternoon light was doing something particular to the parking lot that nobody would be able to describe accurately later, but that everyone who was there would remember. Logan Steele reached out and put his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. Not a dramatic gesture, not performed, just the contact of a man acknowledging something real, and then he stepped back. And Ethan Cole dialed his father's number for the second time that afternoon. This time with something to say that was going to take longer than 4 minutes, and this time in front of a crowd that had stopped being a crowd and become something closer to a community of witnesses. The call connected. "Dad," Ethan said, and then he said the rest of it. James Cole listened without saying a word for 11 minutes. Ethan had found a quieter edge of the parking lot. Not private, nothing was private anymore. There were cameras at every angle and people who had stopped pretending they weren't listening, but removed enough that the conversation felt like his own. He talked the way he always talked to his father, directly, without decoration, moving through the facts in the order they mattered rather than the order that would sound most impressive. He told him about Logan's offer. The full structure of it, not just the reward money which James had already absorbed on the first call, but everything that had developed in the hours since. The conversation with Ray Cortez, the San Bernardino chapter's shop, Harrington's request to be involved, Gerald Fitch's business card, and the offer of a longer technical conversation, the journalist with the recorder and the question about systems. He told him about the vision he'd described to Logan, the garage rebuilt, the training program, the young people with mechanical instinct and nowhere to put it. And then he told his father the part he hadn't said yet, the part that had been sitting in him since Logan put his hand on his shoulder and stepped back. He said, "I think this is real, Dad. I don't mean the money. I mean the rest of it. I think if we don't do something with this moment, it closes. These conversations don't stay open forever. People move on to the next thing." He paused. "I don't want to move on to the next thing." James Cole had been listening to all of this from his garage in Malta, Montana, sitting on the stool he kept near the workbench because his back had been bad for 2 years and standing for long periods required planning. The compressor was off. The shop was quiet in the way it got quiet in the late afternoon when the day's work was done and the evening hadn't started, the particular silence of a space that had been full of effort and was now resting. He said, "What does he want from you?" "He hasn't said yet, not specifically, but you know what he's thinking." Ethan looked across the parking lot at Logan, who was talking to Danny with the focused economic body language of a man moving through a checklist. "He wants to fund something," Ethan said, "but he doesn't want to own it. There's a difference in how he talks about it. He keeps using the word conditions. He says money creates conditions. He doesn't say money builds things." A pause from James, then, "He's right about that. I know. He sounds like someone who's made the other mistake before." Ethan thought about this. He had thought about Logan Steele for 3 weeks before this trip, had read everything publicly available about the man, the rides he'd organized, the charity work, the building of the Iron Beast, the philosophy of construction that came through in the interviews he'd given over the years. And yes, there were traces in the early interviews of a man who had tried to solve problems with resources and learned expensively that the problem was never what it appeared to be on the surface. "I think so," he said. Another pause from James, longer this time. Ethan waited because he had learned before he could ride a bike that his father's long pauses were not absence. They were the sound of something being decided. "Come home first," James said finally. "Dad, come home first." James repeated, not sharply, just with the particular firmness of a man stating something he's already finished deciding. "Sit in the garage. Sleep in your own bed. Then we talk about what to do with this." A beat. "These men will still be there in a week. If they're not, they weren't the right men." Ethan breathed out slowly. "Okay." And Ethan, "Yeah?" His father was quiet for one more moment, the specific quiet of a man who is about to say something he has never said in exactly this way before, because the occasion for saying it in exactly this way has never existed before. "I'm proud of you," he said, "not for the money, not for fixing the bike, for going." He paused, "For getting on the bus." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He stood in the parking lot in Riverside, California, with the afternoon moving toward evening and the crowd still behind him and the Iron Beast still at the center of all of it, and he held his father's words the way you hold something that has weight and warmth at the same time. "I'll be home Tuesday," he said. "I'll have the compressor apart," James said. "You can look at it when you get in." And that was James Cole, "I love you," expressed as there will be a mechanical problem waiting for you, because that is what we do. And you being here to work on it with me is what I mean when I say I love you. Ethan put his phone in his pocket and stood still for a moment before turning back. Logan was watching him from across the lot. Not intrusively, just present in the way Logan was always present, with the full weight of his attention available, but not deployed unless it was wanted. When Ethan turned and began walking back, Logan moved to meet him halfway. "Well, Logan said. "He says come home first." Logan nodded immediately without any visible disappointment. "He's right," he said. Ethan looked at him. "You're not going to argue that the timing is important, that these conversations—" "If your father says come home first, you come home first," Logan said. "The timing argument is a pressure tactic. I don't do pressure tactics." He paused. "I'll still be here in a week. Ray will still be here. This isn't going anywhere." "You don't know that." "I know what I intend," Logan said. "And I'm not 18. My intentions don't shift with my mood." He said it without condescension, just as a fact the way Logan stated most facts. Go home. Sit with your father. Come back when you've thought it through properly. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Why are you doing this? He said. Logan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the Iron Beast, and his expression in that moment was the expression of a man looking at something that cost him greatly and was worth every bit of what it cost. Then he looked back at Ethan. I built that machine because I believe that doing something with genuine attention produces a result that doing it without attention cannot, he said. I've believed that my whole life. It's the governing principle of everything I've ever built. He paused. Today, I watched 23 men with genuine expertise fail to see something that you saw in 3 minutes. And the reason you saw it is because someone spent 18 years teaching you to pay attention to the right things. He met Ethan's eyes directly. That's rare. That's rarer than the money. And I don't walk away from rare things. The evening was beginning now in the way California evenings begin. Not a sudden shift, but a gradual change in the quality of the light. Everything softening at the edges. The crowd had thinned further, but the core remained Ray and 2 of his guys, Danny Harrington, a cluster of the mechanics who had stayed Harold, the retired machinist Sarah Okafor still writing in her notebook. The people who couldn't leave yet because the thing hadn't fully resolved itself, and they could feel that. What happened next moved fast and moved in a direction that nobody had anticipated. A car pulled into the outer edge of the parking lot, a newer model sedan slightly too clean for the context with 2 men in it who were dressed with the particular studied casualness of people who work in money and have learned to dress down for situations that require the appearance of accessibility. They had a third person with them, a woman who moved with the focused efficiency of someone managing other people's time professionally. Danny noticed them first because Danny noticed everything that arrived at the perimeter of events he was managing. He watched them park and get out and consult briefly with each other before beginning to move toward the center of the lot. He went to Logan. You know these people? Logan looked. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did a slight compression. The look of a man identifying something he'd been expecting and hadn't been sure would arrive today. Marcus Hale, he said. He runs a motorcycle performance company out of Scottsdale. $300 million in annual revenue. He's been trying to get me into a licensing arrangement for 4 years. Danny processed this. Why today? Because today is on video, Logan said simply. Because the Iron Beast just became the most talked about motorcycle in the country, and whatever solves her and whoever solves her is currently extremely valuable in a way that Hale can see from 300 miles away. He's here for Ethan, Danny said. He's here for Ethan, Logan confirmed. They watched Marcus Hale make his way through the remaining crowd in the practiced ease of a man who had learned to move through rooms that weren't arranged for him. He was 50, well-kept with the particular physical confidence of someone whose net worth had long since become a form of insulation. He found Ethan before Logan or Danny could intercept the introduction. Ethan Cole, he said, extending his hand with a warmth that was professional grade but not insincere. Marcus Hale, I've been watching the stream since about noon. He shook Ethan's hand. What you did today is the most significant public diagnostic demonstration I've seen in 20 years in this industry. Ethan shook his hand. He was polite, attentive, with the particular alertness of someone who has been on guard since childhood for the difference between a genuine offer and an attractive one. Thank you, he said. I don't want to waste your time, Hale said, which was itself a tell people who don't waste time rarely announce their intention not to. I have a facility in Scottsdale, R&D and advanced diagnostics prototype development. We have 12 senior engineers and a budget for talent that isn't constrained by the organizational chart. He paused. I'd like you to come and see it. Ethan looked at him. What for? Hale smiled the smile of a man who appreciates directness because it allows him to deploy his own. Because what you demonstrated today is a diagnostic methodology that my entire engineering team doesn't collectively possess. And I'm in the business of acquiring things that my team doesn't collectively possess. I'm 18, Ethan said. I know. I haven't finished school. I know that too. Hale's smile didn't waver. I also know that the formal credentials don't appear to be the binding constraint in your case. Logan had arrived. He positioned himself not between Hale and Ethan, but beside Ethan, which was a different thing, present but not blocking. Hale acknowledged him with a nod that carried the history of 4 years of declined licensing conversations. Logan, he said. Marcus, Logan said. A pause between them that had texture. Then Hale said to the space between them, I'm not here to step on anything that's already in motion. Nothing is in motion yet, Logan said. The kid goes home on Tuesday. Hale absorbed this. He turned back to Ethan. All right, Tuesday then, but I want you to have my number before you go. Because when you're ready to have a conversation about what's possible beyond a garage in Montana, I want to be in that conversation. He held out a card. I'm not competing with whatever Logan's thinking. I'm offering a different thing. Not better or worse, different. Ethan took the card. He looked at it briefly and put it in his pocket alongside Gerald Fitch's. He said, what would I actually do there? Hale's expression shifted slightly, a genuine engagement replacing the professional warmth. You'd work on real problems, he said, not charity ride demonstrations. Systems failures that cost companies millions. Integration issues in prototype builds that teams of engineers have been unable to resolve. The kind of problems that require exactly the kind of thinking you demonstrated today. He paused. And you'd get paid for it in a way that reflects what that thinking is actually worth. The crowd around this conversation had compressed again. People were close enough to hear, and they were hearing, and the reactions were complex, the particular mixed emotion of people who want a good thing for someone they've just watched do something extraordinary, but who also feel a protective instinct about that person being moved in the wrong direction. Ray Cortez was watching from 10 feet away, and his expression was the expression of a man who has seen this kind of approach before and is calibrating how concerned to be. Danny was making no effort to hide the fact that he was listening. Ethan said, I appreciate the offer. He said it with a completeness that was not dismissive, but was final. The sentence had a period at the end of it that Hale, who was good at reading people, could hear. But, Hale said. No, but, Ethan said, I appreciate it. I'll think about it. He paused. But I'm going home Tuesday and having a conversation with my father, and everything else comes after that. Hale looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded a genuine nod, the nod of a man who recognizes a quality he wasn't expecting and is adjusting his assessment accordingly. Fair enough, he said. He glanced at Logan. Logan. And then he walked back toward his car, his assistant moving to match his pace. The conversation closed. Logan watched him go. Then he said to Ethan quietly, That's the third offer you've handled in the last 2 hours. Ethan looked at him. Were you counting? I was noticing, Logan said. There's a difference. What did you notice? That you handle each one the same way, Logan said. You listen completely. You respond honestly. You don't close doors, and you don't commit to anything that requires more information than you have. He paused. Most people your age in this situation would have already said yes to something. My dad says don't decide anything on the same day you learn about it, Ethan said. The decision you make when you're still in the feeling of a thing is almost never the same decision you make when you've had time to separate the feeling from the information. Logan was quiet for a moment. Then your father says a lot of useful things. He says a lot of things about machines, Ethan said, but they're usually about more than machines. This was the moment, though nobody would identify it as such until later, when the last piece of Logan Steele's decision locked into place. It hadn't been the diagnosis. It hadn't been the repair. It hadn't even been the conversation about the training program and the wasted potential in small towns. It was this an 18-year-old who had just been offered a life-altering amount of money and 2 significant career opportunities in the span of 3 hours, who was standing in the same posture he'd been standing in when he arrived, with the same quality of attention he'd brought to the Iron Beast, saying that his father had taught him not to decide anything on the same day he learned about it. Because that was wisdom. That was real applied earned wisdom, the kind that only comes from watching someone you trust operate by it across enough years that it becomes your own operating principle without you necessarily deciding to adopt it. Logan thought about the 7 years he'd spent building the Iron Beast. He thought about all the times someone had told him he was finished, that the next version was good enough that the marginal improvement didn't justify the continued effort. He thought about the 40 calibrations of the fuel management system, each one incrementally closer to what he'd heard in his head when he imagined the perfect machine. He said, I want to come to Malta. Ethan looked at him. When you're at Brad in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whenever you and your father have had time to talk. He paused. I want to see the garage. I want to meet James. He said the name with a deliberateness that was respectful, not your dad, not your father, but James. Because if we're going to build something, I want to build it from the ground up, and I want to understand the ground. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He'll make you coffee and show you what's wrong with the compressor." "Good," Logan said. "I'm good with compressors." Something moved across Ethan's face, not a smile exactly, but the near relative of one. The expression of someone recognizing that a person means what they say, because the specific thing they're saying is the thing a person who means it would say. Ray Cortez appeared at Logan's shoulder. He had the expression of a man who has been patient through a long day and is now ready to be direct. "I need to say something," he said, addressing both of them equally. They waited. "What happened today is going to be on every motorcycle forum, every mechanics channel, every riding community platform by tomorrow morning," Ray said. "That's already happening. I've been getting texts for the last 2 hours from people who weren't here." He paused. "That means Ethan's name is going to be attached to something very public very fast, and people are going to come at him with things that look like the same offer but aren't." He looked at Ethan directly. "You're going to need people around you who know the difference." Ethan met his eyes. "Are you offering to be one of those people?" Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm saying that the people who came at you today came at you in person where you could read them. The people who are going to come at you next week are going to come through email and phone and intermediaries, and they're going to be better prepared because they'll have done their research." He paused. "You're 18 and you're from a town of 2,000 people. That's not an insult. That's a fact about what you've been exposed to. And there are people in this industry who specialize in the gap between what someone's been exposed to and what's being offered." The bluntness of this landed in the crowd, those close enough to hear it, with a different quality than the other conversations of the afternoon. It wasn't flattering. It wasn't framed as an offer. It was a warning delivered by a man who had operated inside a culture that had a long history of eating people who weren't prepared for what came at them when they became visible. Ethan said, "You're telling me to be careful." "I'm telling you to be careful," Ray said. "I'm going home Tuesday," Ethan said. "My father's going to have the compressor apart." Ray looked at him. Then something crossed his face, the same thing that had crossed Logan's face a moment earlier. The recognition of something that had been built over years and was now visible because the right pressure had been applied. "All right," he said. He glanced at Logan. "He's going to be fine." "I know," Logan said. "I'm standing right here," Ethan said. Both men looked at him. Ray almost smiled, which from Ray was a significant event. "Yeah," he said, "you are." The evening had arrived fully now. The parking lot was different in the evening. The scale of it changed. The distances between people became more apparent. The artificial lighting that had come on created pools of visibility separated by shadow. The remaining crowd had the quality of people who had been somewhere important together and were not yet ready to be the people they were before they arrived. Danny had been handling the logistical closeout of the event for the last hour, coordinating with Gerald on the final charity tallies, managing the equipment breakdown, fielding the calls from media that had been multiplying since the live stream's viewership had peaked at just over 40,000 people, simultaneously watching an 18-year-old fix a motorcycle in a Riverside parking lot. He came back to Logan with his phone in his hand and an expression that was the particular expression of a man who has been processing large numbers for long enough that they've stopped feeling like numbers. "Final charity total," he said. He told Logan the figure. Logan's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it registered the weight of the number. It was the largest single-day charity total the ride had ever generated, not by a small margin, but by more than double. The sponsors who had called during the afternoon about increasing their commitments had followed through, and the live stream's reach had generated online donations from people who had never attended a charity ride and had no connection to the motorcycle community and had simply watched a kid from Montana fix a machine that 23 professionals couldn't fix and had been moved enough by it to give. "Good," Logan said. It was what he always said when the charity number was good, but this time it carried something extra, the awareness that the thing that had driven the number was not the Iron Beast and not the reward and not even the drama of the failed experts. It was Ethan Cole sitting on a bus from Montana because he'd heard about a machine he wanted to understand, arriving at exactly the moment when something needed to be seen that nobody else could see. The right person at the right place. Not because it had been arranged, because it had been allowed to happen. Tom Harrington appeared at Ethan's side. He'd been moving in and out of the conversations of the afternoon, not central, but consistently present, and now he had the focused expression of a man who has made a decision and is executing it. "I want to ask you something before you leave," he said. Ethan waited. "The weight distribution solution on my twin-engine build," Harrington said. "You mentioned a question." It took Ethan half a second to shift registers from the large structural conversations of the last 2 hours back to the mechanical question he'd referenced when Harrington first approached him. He made this shift cleanly, which itself was noted by the people watching. "The frame geometry you published, you moved the forward mounting point 14 millimeters to compensate for the weight bias. But the article doesn't explain why 14 and not 12 or 16. Harrington looked at him. "Because I tried 12 and 16. "What happened at 12? "Vibration at high speed. The resonance frequency of the frame at that mounting point, with 12 millimeters of offset, hit a harmonic that became dangerous above 90. And 16 handling degradation in tight turns. The weight shift was too far forward. It affected the steering geometry under load." "So 14 was the compromise," Ethan said. 14 was the compromise, Harrington confirmed. He paused. "Why does it matter to you?" "Because I'm trying to understand the decision-making," Ethan said. "Not the result, the process of arriving at it. How do you know when you found the right compromise and not just a workable one?" Harrington was quiet for a moment. Around them, the remaining people had gone very still. This question, how do you know when you found the right answer and not just an acceptable one, was not a question that most people asked about mechanical problems. It was a question that most people asked about life, and the reason it landed the way it did in this specific context was that it was being asked about mechanical problems by someone who clearly understood that the answer applied to both. Because it stops asking you to reconsider it," Harrington said finally. "When you hit the right answer, the system becomes quiet. When you're on a workable compromise, there's always a small noise somewhere, a handling note, a vibration, a temperature differential that's within spec but not what you'd want." He paused. "The right answer is the one where all the small noises stop." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's what happened with the Iron Beast when it started," he said. "It didn't sputter into life, it just was right, all at once." "Yeah," Harrington said. He looked at the bike still and waiting at the center of the lot. "That's how you know." The conversation settled into something quiet between them, not silence exactly, but the particular quality of two people who have found a shared language and don't need to keep demonstrating it. Logan was watching from a short distance, and beside him, Ray Cortez, and beside Ray Harold, the retired machinist, who had not left and who had not said much, but who had been present through everything with the specific quality of attention that a person brings to a thing they know they will not see again and want to remember completely. Harold said to no one in particular, "My wife would have loved this." Ray looked at him. "She ride." "She didn't ride," Harold said, "but she loved watching people figure things out. She used to say that the moment when someone understands something they didn't understand before was the most beautiful moment there was." He paused. "She would have stood here all day." Ray looked at the old man for a moment. Then he said, "What was her name?" "Dorothy," Harold said. Ray nodded. He didn't say anything else. But he stayed standing near Harold, and Harold seemed to feel the company because his posture shifted slightly, less held and less self-contained. Ethan had heard this exchange from nearby, and he turned toward Harold and said, "She was right about the moment of understanding." Harold looked at him. "You think so?" "I know so," Ethan said, "because I've had it happen, and it's different from everything else. It's not exciting. It's not loud. It's more like relief, like something that was slightly wrong with the world has become right." Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You're going to do a lot of good, young man." It was a simple thing to say. The kind of thing older people say to younger ones at moments of visible promise, and which usually slides off because it's too general to land anywhere specific. But Harold said it with a precision of feeling the particular weight of someone who has watched things begin and end and knows the difference between a beginning that is real and one that only looks like one that made it land differently. Ethan said, "I hope so, sir," and meant it with the full sincerity of someone for whom hope is not a casual word. Logan looked at the Iron Beast one more time. He had been looking at her all day, which was normal. She was always the center of these events, but this last look was different. He was looking at her the way you look at something that has just shown you something you didn't know it could show you. She had broken at the worst possible moment. She had defeated 23 experts. She had waited in her complete mechanical stubbornness for exactly the right person. He had built her to be perfect. He had not built her to be a catalyst. But maybe those were the same thing. Maybe perfection in the end was not a state of completion, but a quality of readiness. The readiness to reveal what needed to be revealed at the moment when revealing it would matter most. Danny appeared at his shoulder, ready to close it out. Logan took one more look at Ethan, who was now in conversation with 3 people simultaneously and managing all 3 with the same unhurried attention. Then he said, "Yeah, the story's going to be everywhere tomorrow," Danny said. "I know. Are you ready for that?" Logan thought about it. He thought about Marcus Hale driving 300 miles because the stream had gone viral. He thought about the journalist with her recorder. He thought about the 40,000 people who had watched live. He thought about the people who would watch the recording and the people who would see the clips and the people who would read the articles. He said, "The story doesn't belong to us. It belongs to whoever needs it." Danny looked at him. "That's either very wise or very naive." "Probably both," Logan said. "That's usually how the true things are." Across the lot, Ethan Cole put his phone back in his pocket, shook 3 hands in quick succession, and began making his way back toward Logan and Danny with the same easy, unhurried movement he'd had when he first walked up to the Iron Beast. A person who existed at the same pace regardless of what was happening around him, which was its own kind of rare. He had a plane to catch Tuesday morning. He had a compressor to look at when he got home. He had a conversation to finish with his father, the longer version, the one with the full shape of everything, the one that would happen in the garage in the quiet of a Tuesday evening, with the shop smell and the sound of the town outside, and the 2 of them at the workbench, the way they had always been figuring things out together. Everything else, the money, the offers, the calls that were already starting to come, the story that was spreading outward from this parking lot in real time, all of that was real, and all of it would require decisions. But the decisions would be made by a person who had been built for exactly this, in a garage in Malta, Montana, by a man who understood that the failure is never in the part. It's in what the part forgot to talk to. And James Cole had made very sure his son remembered to talk to everything. Ethan flew home Tuesday morning. The plane ticket was the most expensive thing he had ever purchased with his own money, and the fact that it was now categorically trivial relative to what was sitting in the account Logan's people had set up the previous evening did not make it feel trivial. It felt like what it was, a transaction, a decision, a choice made from a specific set of values, and Ethan Cole had been raised to feel the weight of transactions regardless of the surrounding circumstances, because a man who stops feeling the weight of what things cost has started losing his understanding of what things are worth. He landed in Great Falls, took a 2-hour drive east in a truck he'd arranged through a friend, and arrived in Malta on a Tuesday afternoon that was exactly like every other Tuesday afternoon Malta had ever produced. Flat sky, dry air, the particular quiet of a small town in the middle of a vast landscape that has no interest in the drama of the people passing through it. His father's truck was in the lot outside the garage. The shop door was open. Ethan could hear the compressor, or rather he could hear that the compressor had been partially disassembled because the sound it was making was the irregular, incomplete sound of a machine that has been opened and not yet reassembled, running under reduced function because James Cole had started the job and stopped it at a point that would make the diagnosis clear to his son when he arrived. Ethan walked in. James Cole was at the workbench with his back to the door, working on something small with a lamp pulled close. He did not turn around immediately, which was not rudeness, but the established language of a man who hears his son come in and acknowledges the arrival in his own time, because they are in a space where time belongs to whoever is working, not to the social pressure of greeting rituals. "Compressor's got a valve issue," James said. "Second stage. I left it running so you could hear it." Ethan listened. He heard it, the slight irregularity in the compression cycle, the faint whistle that indicated a valve seat that was not seating fully. "Intake valve," he said. "Seat's worn." "That's what I think," James said. He turned around. They looked at each other, father and son in the garage that had been the center of their world for as long as either of them could fully remember, with 5 days of California between them and everything that those 5 days had carried. James looked at his son the way he always looked at him, completely, without rush, reading him the way he read machines, looking for what was working and what was under strain, and what the relationship between those things indicated about the overall condition of the system. "You look the same," James said. "I am the same," Ethan said. James nodded. He turned back to the workbench. "Coffee's on." This was James Cole's version of welcome home. Not an embrace, not an exclamation, not the performance of reunion. "Coffee's on. Sit down. We are the people we were before you left, and that is the best thing I can tell you right now." Ethan poured himself a cup and sat on the stool near the workbench, and they talked for 3 hours without stopping. The real conversation, the one that Ethan had told Logan, needed to happen in the garage, in the quiet, in the language of two people who understood each other without decoration. He told his father everything in the order that it had happened. Not the summary he'd given on the phone, but the full account with all the texture, the feeling of standing at the edge of the crowd watching 23 mechanics fail the moment he walked up to the Iron Beast and felt the diagnosis settle into place the way answers always settled for him, like a physical thing, like weight redistributing to find its balance. He told him about Logan's hand on his shoulder, about Ray Cortez's handshake, and the question about where he'd learned to think like that, about Harrington and the weight distribution question, and the answer that the right solution is the one where all the small noises stop. He told him about Marcus Hale and the card in his pocket, about Gerald Fitch in the other card, about Sarah Okafor and her question about what the system said and the answer he'd given in the parking lot that he'd been turning over ever since because he wasn't sure he'd said it completely. James listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions across the 3 hours, specific technical questions about the diagnostic sequence because James Cole processed emotional events by first establishing their mechanical logic. And once the mechanical logic was clear, the emotional weight became something he could carry without it overwhelming him. At the end of the 3 hours, James was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Logan Steele wants to come here." "Yes, to see this garage." "To understand where it came from," Ethan said. "He said he wants to build from the ground up, and he wants to understand the ground." James looked around the garage, the 3 functional bays, the 3 that weren't the equipment that was aging, but maintained the organizational system that made every tool findable in under 10 seconds, because a disorganized shop was a shop where the work suffered, and James Cole would not let the work suffer, regardless of what else was suffering. He looked at it with the eyes of a man who has inhabited a space so long he has stopped seeing it as it appears to others, and sees it only as it is, every crack in the floor, a known thing, every piece of equipment, a relationship, rather than an object. "All right," James said. Ethan looked at him. "That's it. What else do you want me to say?" James picked up his coffee. "A man who built what you described, who made the offer he made, who told you to go home first, that's a man who knows what he's doing. If he wants to come here and look at the ground, let him look at the ground." He paused. "The ground is solid." And it was. That was the thing James Cole knew about his garage, that nobody who hadn't spent years inside it could know from the outside. It was solid. Not impressive, not resourced, not competitive in the way that the market defined competitive, but solid in the way that things built with genuine attention and maintained with genuine care become solid, the solidity of something that has been tested by real conditions across real time and has not collapsed. Logan arrived on a Friday 3 weeks after the charity ride. He came alone, which was itself a statement. No Danny, no entourage, no assistant with a schedule. He drove himself from the airport in a rental truck, which was another statement, and he arrived at the Cole garage at 9 in the morning with a coffee from the mall station down the road, because he'd asked Ethan on the phone what the local coffee situation was, and Ethan had been honest about it, and Logan had decided that honesty about small things was a reliable indicator of honesty about large ones. James Cole met him at the door. They shook hands and looked at each other, and the look between them was the look of 2 men who have each spent decades doing difficult things with genuine attention and recognize that quality in each other before a word is spoken. It is a specific kind of recognition, not warm exactly, not the warmth of immediate connection, but the particular respect of professionals who have just established that they are working in the same register. "Your son," James said, "told me you're good with compressors." Logan almost smiled. "Decent," he said. James stepped aside to let him in and pointed at the compressor. "Second stage intake valve," he said. "Seat's worn. I've got the part, but I've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Logan asked. James looked at him. "To see if you'd want to help." Logan set his coffee down on the workbench and rolled up his sleeves. They spent the first 2 hours working on the compressor, and Ethan sat on his stool and watched because this was not a moment for him to be central. This was a moment for two men to establish the language they were going to need for every conversation that came after, and the language they chose was the right one tools and diagnostics and the particular honesty of mechanical work where the problem doesn't respond to charm or persuasion or the authority of reputation, only to the correct application of understanding. By the time the compressor was running clean, James and Logan had found each other in the way that people who are going to be able to work together find each other. Not friendship yet, that would take longer. But the foundational thing, the trust that comes from watching a person approach a real problem and seeing the quality of their approach. Logan stood up from the compressor and said, "Tell me what you need." James said, "The lifts first. Bays 4, 5, and 6. They're hydraulic, the seals have failed, and I haven't had the capital to replace them." "What else?" James told him. He went through it the way Ethan had gone through it in the parking lot, not a pitch, not an appeal, but an accurate inventory. The alignment system, the diagnostic equipment, the structural work on the building, the tooling gaps. He told it plainly in numbers without embarrassment, because a man who is embarrassed by the honest account of his situation has let his pride become an obstacle to the work, and James Cole had made peace with that distinction a long time ago. Logan listened without writing anything down, which James noticed, and which meant either Logan had a very good memory or he'd already made his decision, and the inventory was confirmation rather than new information. When James finished, Logan said, 250,000 covers all of it. "Comfortably," James said, "with equipment left over." "All right." Logan looked at the 3 dead bays. "I'm not buying this garage," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This is yours, it was your father's, and it's yours, and if things go the way I think they might, it'll be Ethan's." He paused. "What I'm doing is making an investment in a model, a way of teaching, and the return I'm looking for is not financial." James looked at him. "What's the return?" 10 mechanics, Logan said, "in 5 years. 10 young people from this region who can do what your son does, not necessarily at his level, because his level took 18 years to build with his specific raw material. But 10 people who understand systems, who think in relationships rather than parts, who can walk up to a machine nobody else has solved and find the failure because they know how to read what's still working." He paused. "That's the return." James was quiet for the moment, then, "You can't guarantee that." "I know. Some of the kids who come through here are going to be difficult. Some of them are going to have histories that make the work harder. Some of them are going to leave before they finish." "I know that too," Logan said. "I'm not investing in certainty. I'm investing in the attempt." He met James's eyes directly. "The attempt to do this right in the right place with the right people is worth the investment, regardless of whether every individual outcome is successful. Because the model itself, if it works even partially, produces something the industry doesn't currently have." James looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Ethan told me you said money creates conditions." "It does," Logan said, "and you believe the condition here is right." "I believe the condition here already exists," Logan said. "I'm not creating it, I'm resourcing it. There's a significant difference." This distinction between creating a condition and resourcing one that already exists landed for James Cole the way the right answer always landed in his experience, with a particular quality of something that stops asking to be reconsidered. This man understood what he was looking at. He had come here and spent 2 hours on a compressor and listened to an honest inventory, and he had understood that the thing of value was not the building or the equipment, but the 18 years of teaching that had produced a son who could read the Iron Beast in under 3 minutes. You could not buy that. Logan had said so in the parking lot, and he was saying it again here in different words. You could not buy what James had built. You could resource it. You could give it room to expand. But the thing itself, the methodology, the philosophy, the specific way of seeing that James Cole had transmitted to his son across a decade and a half of working side by side in this garage, that was not for sale because it was not a product. It was a practice. And practices belong to the people who embody them. "All right," James said. For the second time since Riverside, those were the only words he needed. The construction started 6 weeks later. The bays were the first thing hydraulic lifts rebuilt. Not replaced with the cheapest functional option, but with equipment that would last another 30 years. Because James Cole's view was that if you were going to do it, you were going to do it correctly. And Logan's view aligned perfectly with this because it was essentially the same view. The alignment system went in during the second week, the diagnostic equipment during the third. The structural work on the building ran concurrently with everything else handled by a contractor from Glasgow who had grown up in Phillips County and who brought 2 young apprentices he was training, which meant the building work itself became a small example of the model they were trying to create. Ethan was present for all of it. He had deferred the larger conversations. Hale's offer in Scottsdale remained an open door. Fitch's invitation to a longer technical conversation was scheduled for the spring because his father had said come home first, and what he'd found when he came home was that the right work was already here. The first apprentice arrived 8 weeks after Logan's visit. His name was Darius Webb, 17 years old, from a farm outside Saco, 40 miles west. He had been brought to James Cole's attention by a high school teacher who had called the garage on a Tuesday afternoon and said in the direct, slightly uncertain way of a person who is not sure if what they're doing makes sense, "I have a student who takes apart anything he can find and puts it back together correctly. I don't know what to do with him, and I thought maybe you would." James had said, "Bring him in." Darius arrived on a Saturday morning with the particular body language of a young man who has been told he's going somewhere but hasn't been told why, and who is performing nonchalance over the top of a significant anxiety. He was tall, lean, with hands that were already marked by the kind of work that leaves its evidence permanently, the small scars and calluses of someone who has been doing physical things with metal and machinery since they were old enough to reach. Ethan met him at the door. He showed him around the garage without explanation or preamble, the same way his father had always shown him things. "Here is the thing, observe it, form your own questions." He took him to the diagnostic station and the alignment bay and the new lifts, and then he took him to the compressor that he and Logan and James had repaired together, which was running perfectly, and he said, "What do you hear?" Darius listened. He frowned. He listened again, tilting his head slightly in the way of someone who is hearing something they can't quite place. He stopped. "It's almost nothing. It's like a very faint resonance," Ethan said. "Third stage outlet. The valve seat is good, but the outlet fitting has a microscopic gap. Not a functional problem, it'll run fine for years. But it's there." Darius stared at the compressor. "How do you hear that?" "You stop listening for what's wrong," Ethan said. "You start listening for what's almost perfect." The gap between almost perfect and perfect is where the information lives. Darius turned and looked at him with the expression that Ethan recognized because he had felt it himself, the expression of someone who has just been given a key they didn't know they needed. "Okay," Darius said. "How do I learn that?" "The same way I did," Ethan said. "Slowly, in this garage, on machines that need understanding rather than just repair." He paused. "It takes longer than you want it to, but it produces something that lasts." Darius showed up the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the third Saturday, he was asking questions that made James Cole stop whatever he was doing and pay attention, which was the highest form of recognition James Cole offered. By the 8th Saturday, he had diagnosed a fuel delivery problem on a tractor that a larger shop 40 miles away had been unable to solve for 3 weeks, and the farmer whose tractor it was had called James afterward and said in the flat, unelaborated way of rural men expressing significant things, "Your young fella figured it out." James had told Ethan. Ethan had told Darius. Darius had said nothing, but his posture in the garage the following Saturday was the posture of someone who has had confirmation of something they suspected about themselves and are now operating from a different foundation. This was the thing Ethan had not been able to say completely in the parking lot in Riverside when Sarah Okafor asked him what the system said. He had said that expertise was not the same as understanding, that training focused on parts instead of relationships. All of that was true. But the rest of it, the part he'd found in the garage in the weeks since coming home, was this: the solution to a system that trained people wrong was not to train them differently in the same kind of institution. It was to find the places where the right training already existed in the informal, unconstructed, completely authentic form of a father teaching a son in a garage, because it was the only education available, and to resource those places without changing what made them work. Because what made them work was not curriculum. It was not equipment or institutional affiliation or credential pathways. It was the presence of someone who genuinely understood something and was willing to transmit that understanding through proximity and patience and the daily practice of showing up to real problems and treating them as worthy of real attention. Logan came back to Malta in the spring. He came with a Ray Cortez this time, and Ray brought a young man from San Bernardino named Marcus, who was 20 years old and had been working in the chapter's shop for 8 months, and who Ray described with the careful understatement of a man who has learned to speak about talent without overselling it as someone who sees things. Marcus spent 2 days in the coal garage. He worked alongside Darius, who was now comfortable enough in the space to work with someone new without losing the quality of his attention. They did not become friends in 2 days. They were too different in background and expression for that kind of speed, but they recognized each other across the difference in the particular way of young people who have been told their whole lives that they're unusual and have just met someone else who has been told the same thing. On the second day, a truck came in with an engine problem that 3 people had looked at without resolution. Ethan put Marcus and Darius on it together and told them he'd be in the next bay if they needed him. They didn't need him. They found the problem in 40 minutes, a fuel trim issue compounded by a vacuum leak that was intermittent enough to evade standard diagnostics, and they found it by doing exactly what Ethan had described to Darius on his first Saturday, listening for the gap between almost perfect and perfect. When they told Ethan, he looked at their faces, Darius's quiet satisfaction, Marcus's slightly stunned look of someone who has just learned that what he'd been doing instinctively had a name and a method and a community, and he felt the specific emotion that has no clean label, the one that is partly pride and partly relief and partly grief for all the time that passes before the right things find each other. He said, write it down, the full diagnostic sequence, every step you took and why. Marcus looked at him. Why, well, because the next person who comes through here needs to learn it, Ethan said. And the way they learn it is from the record of someone who figured it out before them. He paused. That's how knowledge survives. Not in the people who have it, in the record they leave for the people who come after. Logan was standing in the doorway. He had come from the next bay, where he'd been talking to James, and he had heard the last part of this exchange. He looked at Ethan for a moment with the expression he'd had in the Riverside parking lot, the one that contained recognition and something harder to name. He said, your father told me something this morning. Ethan waited. He said that when you were 11, you rebuilt a carburetor correctly the first time without being shown. He said he stood there and watched you do it and didn't tell you it was right because he wanted to see if you'd check your own work. Ethan was quiet. He remembered this. He remembered the particular held breath of finishing something and not knowing if it was right, and then running it through his own logic again from the beginning and finding that it was right, and the feeling of that, not triumph, not excitement, just the quiet certainty of a completed thing. Did you check? Logan asked. 3 times, Ethan said. Logan nodded. That's what your father said. He paused. He said that was the moment he knew. He looked at Ethan directly. Not that you were talented, that you were trustworthy, that you'd always check your own work regardless of whether anyone was watching. The garage was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a space where something true has been said and the people in it are letting it settle. Darius was listening. Marcus was listening. James, who had appeared in the doorway behind Logan at some point without anyone noticing, was listening. Ethan said, he never told me that. No, James said from the doorway. I didn't think you needed to hear it to keep doing it. This was James Cole, complete and entire. The understanding that a thing done for its own sake is corrupted the moment it is performed for recognition, and the parental wisdom to withhold the recognition specifically because the thing was already being done correctly, and withholding recognition was the only way to protect it. Ethan looked at his father for a long moment. He did not say what he felt because he had been raised by a man who expressed love as presence and as work and as the willingness to take a machine apart and leave it half open so that your son had something to solve when he walked in the door. He understood this language and he responded in it. He turned back to Marcus and Darius and said, write it down, and the instruction carried everything because the instruction was itself the response. The thing we do here is transmit. The thing we do is leave the record. The thing we do is make sure that what we know outlasts the moment of knowing it. Cole Mechanical, the name they settled on, simply because it was what it was, became a real thing by the end of that year. Not famous, not publicly launched, not announced with the kind of event that Logan would have organized for a charity ride. Just operational. A garage in Malta, Montana with 6 functioning bays and current equipment, and 2 apprentices who came on Saturdays, and 1 who had started coming Tuesdays as well because the Saturdays weren't enough. The charity connections that had formed in Riverside fed into it in ways that nobody had precisely planned. Ray Cortez sent 2 more young men from San Bernardino over the course of the year. Not young men with obvious futures, but young men with mechanical instinct and the specific hunger of people who have been looking for somewhere to put something real and haven't found it. Tom Harrington called twice with technical questions that were really invitations to collaboration, and the second time he drove up with a prototype problem he'd been unable to solve and spent a weekend in the Cole garage working through it alongside Ethan and James, and left having solved it and having understood something about his own diagnostic process that 22 years of professional building had not surfaced. Gerald Fitch sent papers, 3 of them over the course of the year, deep technical documents about firmware architecture and mechanical system integration that represented the continuation of the conversation he'd offered in the parking lot. Ethan read each one twice and called Fitch afterward, and the calls lasted between 90 minutes and 2 hours, and James could hear his son on the phone in the evenings asking questions that made him set down whatever he was doing and listen, not because he could always follow the technical in depth, but because the quality of the questions was the quality of his son's mind fully deployed, and that was something he wanted to witness whenever it was happening. Marcus Hale called in December, not with pressure with a question. He had a system failure in a prototype that his R&D team had been working on for 6 months and hadn't been able to resolve. He described it over the phone with the careful precision of a man who had learned to speak Ethan's language, not what was broken, but what was still working and what the working parts seemed to be working around. Ethan listened to the description. He asked 4 questions. Then he said, "It's in the feedback loop between the traction management system and the ABS calibration. They're both reading the same sensor, but the firmware is treating the readings as independent events rather than a single input. When conditions change fast enough, they issue conflicting corrections at the same time, and the system defaults to neutral, which reads as a failure mode." Silence on the line, then Hale said, "We've had 12 engineers on this for 6 months. Did they read the sensor documentation?" Well, a longer silence. "I'll find out," Hale said. He called back 2 days later. The sensor documentation had a note about dual system reading conflicts in the revision history, he said. Buried, not flagged as significant. A pause. "You were right. The documentation usually has the answer," Ethan said. "It just doesn't always announce itself." Hale was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is there any version of a consulting arrangement that works for you? Not employment, not relocation. Just when I have something that my team can't resolve, I want to be able to call." Ethan thought about it. He thought about his father's rule, don't decide on the same day you learn. But this wasn't new information. He'd been thinking about what he was and wasn't willing to do since the parking lot in Riverside across months of garage work and apprentice teaching and technical phone calls and the slow, genuine construction of something real. "Yes," he said, "on my schedule, when I have capacity, and you'd need to send me the full documentation package for anything you want me to look at." "Done," Hale said without hesitation, which told Ethan that Hale had been patient for months, specifically because he'd understood this was the arrangement that would work and had been waiting for Ethan to arrive at it himself. Logan came for the year-end visit in December with the quiet regularity of someone who has made a commitment and keeps it without announcement. He sat with James at the workbench while Ethan ran a training session with 3 apprentices in Bay 4, and the 2 men drank coffee and didn't talk for long stretches, which was fine because they had learned to be comfortable in the particular companionship of people who have made something together and no longer need to discuss it constantly to feel its reality. At one point, James said, "He's better than I taught him to be." Logan looked at him. "That's what teaching is," he said. "You give them the foundation and they build higher than the foundation." James nodded. He looked at his son through the bay window. Ethan crouched beside a machine, talking one of the apprentices through a diagnostic sequence with the patient, specific attention that was the most recognizable thing about him, the quality that had been the same at 11, rebuilding a carburetor as it was at 18, reading the Iron Beast as it was now, talking a 17-year-old through the process of listening for the gap between almost perfect and perfect. "He checks his work," James said, "every time, even when he knows it's right." "I know," Logan said. "You told me." "I told him too," James said. "Eventually." Logan looked at him. "What did he say?" James was quiet for a moment. He said he knows. He said he learned it from watching me. He paused. I didn't know he was watching that carefully. They always are, Logan said. The ones who are going to do something real with it, they're always watching more carefully than you know. The end of the year brought a letter, handwritten, which was unexpected on plain paper with a Malta postmark because Harold, the retired machinist, who had stood at the edge of the Riverside crowd thinking about Dorothy, had driven out from California to visit a cousin in Montana and had looked up the Cole garage address specifically to send it rather than email. The letter was addressed to Ethan, and it said in the careful block printing of a man who took correspondence seriously, I have been thinking about what you said about the moment of understanding, feeling like relief, like something slightly wrong with the world becoming right. Dorothy used to say the same thing about music, that the resolution of a chord was not the end of something, but the correction of something, the world returning to the shape it wanted. I think you understand the same thing as she understood, and I wanted you to know that she would have been very glad about what you're building. So am I. Ethan read the letters twice. Then he put it on the workbench where it stayed visible for the rest of the winter. Because some things need to remain where they can be seen. Some things need to be kept where the light reaches them, where they can be a reminder not of what was accomplished in a parking lot on a Saturday afternoon, but of what the accomplishment was actually for. It was for this. For Darius Webb on a Saturday morning learning to hear the gap between almost perfect and perfect. For Marcus from San Bernardino writing down a diagnostic sequence so the next person didn't have to start from zero. For a compressor running clean in a Malta garage for hydraulic lifts that worked in all 6 bays for a training program that had no name yet and no credentials and no institutional affiliation and was already doing the thing that mattered. For James Cole at 64 working in a garage that was finally resourced to match the quality of the work he had always done in it. For Logan Steele, who had built a machine over 7 years because he believed that genuine attention produced results that inattention could not, and who had discovered in a Riverside parking lot that the same principle applied to people, that a father who had paid genuine attention to the development of a mind had produced something that no amount of money or equipment or institutional structure could have manufactured. For Dorothy, who had said that the resolution of a chord was not the end of something, but the correction of something. For the Iron Beast sitting in Logan's garage in Fontana running perfectly, having done the most important thing she had ever done, not by running flawlessly for 112,000 miles, but by breaking down at exactly the right moment in front of exactly the right crowd and waiting for exactly the right person. Ethan Cole closed the garage on the last evening of December and stood in the quiet for a moment before turning off the lights. The compressor was running clean, steady, no third stage resonance, no gap between almost perfect and perfect, because they had fixed the fitting on a Tuesday afternoon in November, and the sound had changed the way Logan had described it, the way Harrington had described it all. The small noises stopped. He thought about Malta, Montana, population 2,000 a town. The economy had stopped looking at where a man had raised a son in a garage and taught him that the failure is never in the part. It's in what the part forgot to talk to. He thought about the bus ticket, the decision to go, the particular courage of getting on a bus when you don't know what you'll find at the other end, only that the thing waiting there is worth understanding. He thought about his father's hand, 30 years of honest work in its calluses, pressing a cup of coffee into his hand on a Tuesday afternoon and saying the compressor made a bad sound this morning, which was his father's way of saying, you are home and home is where the work is and the work is what we are. He turned off the lights and locked the door. Cole Mechanical stood behind him, 6 bays full tools in their places, the record of a year's worth of real work on the walls and the workbenches and in the logbooks and in the minds of the young people who had passed through it and would carry it forward into the machines they hadn't yet touched and the problems they hadn't yet faced and the apprentices they would one day teach. The best inheritance is not what you leave behind. It is what you build into the people who come after you so completely that they carry it forward without knowing they're carrying it until the day they find themselves crouched beside a machine that nobody else can read in a parking lot or a garage or a field, and they go quiet in the particular way, and they look at the system and they see it whole, and the answer comes not as inspiration but as recognition, as something that was always there, waiting to be seen by someone who had been taught how to look.